Hello everyone and welcome to the Tank Club. This video is going to be your ultimate build to help you master dungeon content in the Elder Scrolls Online. Today we're diving into our latest dungeon tank build, which has been thoroughly updated for the Scions of Ethelia patch. This build is your key to success in 4-player veteran in hard mode dungeons, offering everything from the optimal class selection to the most effective gear and skill setups. Our comprehensive guide doesn't just stop at basic recommendations. We've tailored this build for versatility, providing customizable skills and gear for options suitable for every class and group composition. Whether you're tackling content with 3 damage dealers or a mix of 2 damage dealers and a healer, this build adapts to your needs, ensuring you're equipped to face every challenge. Having personally tested and succeeded in every veteran dungeon, achieving no death runs, hard mode completions and speed runs, we're confident that this build will elevate your game. Dungeon tanking in ESO offers a unique opportunity for customization, unlike the rigid structures found in larger 12-player trials. In dungeons, your gear choices impact a much smaller sized team, allowing for a more personalized approach to how you set up. Join us as we explore this build in detail, from tanking tactics to gear selections, ensuring that you're ready to battle through any dungeon scenario, whether you're a seasoned veteran looking to refine your strategy or a newcomer eager to make your mark. Our ESO dungeon tank build is the perfect companion to help you conquer all of the challenges that you'll face while doing dungeons in the Elder Scrolls Online. So admittedly, this video is going to be quite long, and that's because we're doing every single class. We've got multiple gear options and details, so you can skip past the parts that you're not going to be needing to know by using the timestamps, and then just focusing on the information that you do need to know by doing that. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is our dungeon tank class tier list. So it's possible to tank in dungeons on every single class. Every class has some format or possibility to tank in dungeon content. Now, some of them are just more useful than others. Some provide more group benefits, some are just best for the user only, so they don't provide many group buffs. This tier list is just my opinion on what is the best class for 4-person dungeon content. So at the very top, number 1, the best class in the Elder Scrolls Online for dungeon content is the Arcanist. Now, they appear at the very top of this list, and it's entirely down to the fact that they have so many useful buffs, benefits, debuffs for 4-player content. From my own personal experience using an Arcanist tank, my group's total DPS increased by a significant amount when I started using an Arcanist tank. So it's something that is tried and tested, and I know for a fact it is much better than everything else. Pretty much every skill an Arcanist has provides some kind of group benefit or some usefulness to the group, and they just have so much packed into every skill. So each skill doesn't just do that one thing, it does multiple things. Like each skill will do a buff, a debuff, maybe something else, so there's quite a lot packed into every single skill. Arcanists are offering a minimum of 9 group buffs or enemy debuffs, which is just absolutely exceptional, and it's unmatched by any other class. No other class can do this. Some of the things the Arcanists provide are basically replacing gear sets, so you don't need to use a 5p set because you've got an Arcanist instead, and their survival is just absolutely fantastic as well, with that huge damage shield, the auto healing and that kind of stuff. So Arcanist is by far, a long way, the most superior class to play for dungeon content. Secondly, the Dragonknight, and this is mostly just because of the sustain and the survival, because this is largely beneficial to a huge amount of players. So if you're a beginner player, you're going to benefit. If you're not a beginner player, but maybe you're not very experienced at tanking, you're going to benefit from that as well. So the sustain, the survival benefits of a Dragonknight are vastly superior. They also possess the absolute best crowd control skills in the game by a long way. So they have chains, they have talons, they have the best crowd control that is also the most sustainable. They do provide some good group buffs, but some of them are kind of not as useful. So when you take Engulfing Flames, for example, your group might not have any use for that. You've also got things like Igneous Weapons, which is a good skill, but your group might not be able to make full use of it. Maybe you don't have damage dealers using ultimate potions, and in dungeon content a lot of groups don't want to, so then Igneous Weapons becomes less useful. Obviously Igneous Weapons can be really good for beginner groups when people maybe don't use potions on cooldown, so there's different situations where it might be good and then other times where it might not. Stone Giant, again, another decent buff, but when you're only buffing 2 people potentially, it's a lot of micromanagement to improve the DPS of 2 people. But at the same time, it's worth doing if you can do it because it's still a group buff. So it is kind of tricky. They are very good and they do provide more than most other classes, but at the same time, it's not as good as the Arcanist basically. That sustain for their Magicka and stamina though is the most superior thing. Being able to cast your ultimate and get all your resources back is fantastic. Being able to spam Igneous Shield to give yourself a shield and your group a shield while also converting the Magicka cost from using Igneous Shield into the stamina return from the passive makes them great. And they're virtually unkillable when they use their Magma Shell ultimate. So the Necromancer comes in 3rd on this list, and that is again a lot to do with the survival, being able to fully resurrect a group. They have quite a lot of buffing potential for small groups, and they also have unmatched ultimate regeneration. Necros can auto-chain with their major resolve skill, so you cast that. It also activates a chain which pulls enemies and also taunts them, so that's really, really strong. They have like unmatched survival against enemies that are applying damage over time. So if you're against a really, really difficult boss that is applying dots to your character, using a Necro is going to be far superior than pretty much every other class. But it's only that one specific real situation where it would be more useful than anything else. Necros can also absorb both enemy corpses when enemies are killed, alongside their own corpses that can be created to generate huge amounts of ultimate. Meaning they can get back their ultimate very quickly, they can keep casting their ultimate much more frequently than other classes, and this is even more the case during ad pulls. So if you need ultimate really fast and you're going to be dealing with bosses that apply that heavy damage over time effect, then the Necromancer is going to be the best. At kind of this stage, if you're not going to play one of those 3, the Warden, the Sorcerer, the Templar, the Nightblade, while they can all tank, and they can tank well, but they just don't offer any significant reason to use them over an Arcanist or a Dragonknight. So Arcanist and Dragonknight are kind of way ahead in terms of dungeon content compared to the others. But I'm not saying they can't tank, they absolutely can. Now each class has some buffs and benefits, but these largely overlap with things that can be already provided in easier ways and alternative ways. So like, yes, they do have a unique buff, but a lot of the things on offer from those classes can be obtained in many, many other ways and other sources, so it doesn't make them essential. Wardens are the best of the bunch, and then Sorcerers are kind of just behind. The Nightblade is a super strong tank. They can reduce damage by huge amounts, so it makes them very strong at actual tanking. Like, they are good for just physical tanking. If you just want to stand there and block damage and take damage, then obviously the Nightblade is great. But there's not a whole lot more they can do other than that. Templar tanks are best suited to dungeon content more so than any other content in the game, but even then, they're just not as strong as every other class. They offer very little utility, slightly more than a Nightblade however, and then both the Nightblade and the Templar have absolutely no access to any kind of immobilizations, so it makes them really, really weak for ad pulls, it makes them really poor at that crowd control, so that makes that just a little bit more difficult. Those same classes alongside the Sorcerer also don't have any class-based pull or any Magicka-based pull or chain skill, which means they're forced to use the very lackluster skill, Silver Leash, to deal with all of their crowd control. So just to kind of recap on that, Arcanist is the #1 class, in my opinion, for dungeon tanking, and then you've got the Dragonknight, then the Necro, and then pretty much everything else, but Warden and Sorcerer slightly ahead of the Templar and the Nightblade. Okay, so we've got the tank class, now it's time to look at tank race. Now, more than anything else, the Nord is the best kind of race that you can choose, and this is largely down to the offering that it has, the benefits that it provides you as a tank. The Nord is the most superior option. You will get additional resistances, ultimate gain, stamina, and health, and so they are the superior option for general tanking. Now on certain classes, this might not be as essential. So if we take an Arcanist for example, the Arcanist can already reach the resistance cap without being a Nord. In that case, you don't need to choose the Nord, and maybe you want to go with the next best option. Now the next best option would generally be something that provides the sustain benefit, in which case you could consider the Imperial. Now the Imperial has again increased stats to health and stamina, but also has reduced cost of all abilities, including ultimate, including every single skill that they use regardless of what it costs. So the Imperial would be a very good option, especially for the Arcanist, because they just have that cost reduction there, which is really, really useful. Another option would be the Red Guard. Now the Red Guard is kind of not used as frequently as other classes, but they are very good. they are able to use a Magicka skill, and then every few seconds they'll get stamina back. In a similar way to the Dragonknight using Igneous Shield, the Red Guard can also do a similar thing. So Red Guards are very good. If you're typically struggling for stamina sustain, then the Red Guard could be a very strong option. So those would be my top 3 races to choose for this dungeon tank build. You can, however, play whichever race you like, so it's not a significant problem if you're not one of these 3 races. If you choose something else, it is going to make some things slightly harder, but you can just change your build to accommodate that. So if you didn't go with a Nord, but then you're having real trouble because you're taking too much damage against a certain fight, then you would just need to maybe use reinforced gear or a defending one-hander to kind of get those resistances up to the same level. So there are ways to overcome some of these issues if you didn't go with one of these particular races, and maybe you just like the aesthetic appearance of a certain race, in which case you can go with that. It's not going to cause a significant problem for you to be able to tank content. It is just going to make it slightly harder that you haven't optimized absolutely perfectly with your race choice. When we look at our consumables and Mundus Stone, the best option to go for the Mundus Stone is the Atronach. Now the Atronach will increase your Magicka Recovery, and this is the absolute best option. With the gear that we're going to be using, this is also going to buff up the Atronach Mundus Stone. And the reason why this is so important is because Magicka Recovery will return Magicka to us every 2 seconds, and this means that we can then cast most of our skills more frequently. Now, as a tank, pretty much all of your skills are going to cost Magicka, and you're going to focus on making them cost Magicka because you're going to be using your stamina for blocking, for dodging, for breaking free, and for sprinting, and then your Magicka is saved for just using that on your skills. And by having lots and lots of recovery, you're going to be able to cast things more often, you're going to be able to maintain more buffs and debuffs, and it just means you're going to be able to perform better as a tank. Another Mundus Stone you could use would be the Lady, which increases your maximum resistances. Typically, I wouldn't advise this in most cases unless you are doing the absolute hardest, hard mode veteran dungeon, and it's causing you a significant problem with the amount of dot damage or bleed damage you're taking, and you're not able to achieve a similar result by switching things like your gear traits or using major and minor resolve. For your food, there is 4 possible good options. My number 1 food is Ozaga's Red Frothgar. Now this will give you increased max health by 5,395 and additional Magicka Recovery by 493. Now having more max health means we can receive more damage before we die. Having more Magicka Recovery, we already talked about, is great because we need to be casting more skills. So this is a fantastic food for achieving that. In situations where I need to block a little bit more often and I have a few more issues with certain mechanics or whatever it is, I then switch to Bewitched Sugar Skulls. This will increase max health by 4,620 and max stamina and Magicka by 4,250. Having that extra Magicka and stamina also gets increased by other multipliers that we're going to talk about later on, so this will actually be more than what is stayed on the food. And this can be quite significant. Like I say, when I'm in those situations where I need to block more, having that extra health recovery, having that extra max stamina, having the extra Magicka so I can cast maybe 1 or 2 more skills is very, very useful, but it's not something that I use all the time. Now, alternatively to that, in situations where I don't need as much Magicka Recovery, so maybe you've got 4,000 Magicka Recovery fully buffed, maybe that's too much. If you're somebody who does not block very often, then using one of the other foods, Jewels of Misrule. This is going to increase stamina and Magicka Recovery by 357, so a little bit less recovery on the Magicka, but you get the additional stamina recovery compared to Red Frothgar. The max health is increased by 3927, so it's a nice food to increase stamina and Magicka Recovery. Now, typically, you might not be wanting to increase your stamina recovery because you block quite a lot. That is perfectly fine. This food wouldn't be the best option in that case. If you are somebody who is just specifically blocking heavy attacks, then this is the absolute food to go for because you are going to get those stamina ticks, so you might as well be benefiting from having stamina incoming from your food. Now, if you've got the recipe or you're willing to part with quite a bit of cash, then you could use Ozaga's Smoked Bear Hunch, and this will increase max health by 4,312, and it will also add in health recovery alongside stamina and Magicka Recovery. So you'll get 406 health recovery alongside 369 Magicka and stamina recovery. So this is like a buffed up version of the Jewels of Misrule, but it's a lot more expensive. So for the sake of getting that extra health recovery and a very small increase on your max health and health recovery, generally not worth it. But if you wanted to really optimize it, then going for this would be the best option. Onto potions, and there's kind of 3 main potions that you want to be considering for tanking. Now the first one would be your Essence of Health potion. This is your typical potion that you're going to use for pretty much everything. So this is your Tri-Stat potion basically. This can be crafted by using Bug Loss, Columbine and Mountain Flower. There are other ingredients that will also combine to make this. So you're going to restore all 3 resources, so 8,369 health and then 7,582 Magicka and Stamina. Alongside that, you'll also get Major Endurance, Major Intellect and Major Fortitude, which gives you those major buffs that increase your recoveries. So it's a very, very strong general potion and something that is very essential to use. The next option is an Essence of Magicka potion, also known as Heroism potions. These are crafted using Columbine, Dragon's Blood and Dragon's Room. Now what these potions do is they will restore stamina, they'll restore Magicka, so 7,582 of each. They'll also give you Major Endurance and Major Intellect, increasing your recoveries, but then they will also grant you Minor Heroism, restoring 1 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. If you've got your Alchemy passives, this will be for the full 45 seconds of its cooldown. So these are very good in situations where you want to get more ultimate gain and maybe you don't have the bar space to slot something like Heroic Slash, which provides the same benefit, so then this would be an excellent potion to use. The final potion would be an Essence of Immovability. So these are crafted using Columbine, Mountain Flower and the Mirror's Rot, and the main strength here is this immunity to knockbacks. So you get Restore Health by 8,369, Restore Stamina by 7,582, you get the Major Fortitude and Endurance for the additional recoveries, but then you become immune to knockbacks and disabling effects for 8 seconds. This is really strong in fights where you know exactly what to expect, when to expect a knockback, when to expect a disabling effect. You pop the potion and then it doesn't affect you. So these can be very, very strong for those particular situations. So for kind of other stats and information that's important to know, with regards to your general stats, you want to be kind of reaching 40k health. Aim for that 40k health mark when you're fully buffed, so if you've got a Warden in your group, you can have less because they're going to give you extra health. In easier dungeons, you can use a lot less, but for veteran hard modes, more health is definitely more valuable. This might mean that you need to put all of your points into health. Having more than 40k health will be significant in terms of allowing you to not have to block as much and being able to survive for longer periods of time. Stamina is also a vital resource because it's needed for dodging, blocking, breaking free, sprinting, and for some of the skills that you're going to be using. You want to aim for around 20,000 stamina. That's a general good amount. More experienced players can use less because they're going to block a lot less. Or with certain classes, you have a much easier time regaining stamina. So a Dragonknight is easier at gaining stamina than every other class, so they can get away with having less maximum stamina. When it comes to Magicka, 15k is a very good general amount to go for. It's essential for tanking as it's the key resource used for almost all of your skills. So having more than 15,000 is really that kind of base value you want to be at. Now, while you want to have enough Magicka so you can keep casting abilities as often as possible, you don't need to stack Magicka super high, as you'll be regenerating it via your Magicka Recovery, so Magicka Recovery is the much more vital stat to worry about. When we look at resistances, you want to have 33k resistances. They are very useful for simply reducing your incoming damage, whether you're being hit by a single target heavy attack or a nasty damage over time. Resistances will have you covered. 33.1k is the cap of resistances, so you don't want to have any more than that because it's a waste. Having slightly less doesn't have a huge impact, so if you can't quite reach 33k, if you're at 32k, it's still going to be very strong. It's not going to be that much difference between 32 and 33,000. When doing base game dungeons, resistances are completely unimportant. You don't need to hit 33k for that. You could get away with just having 20k. But for DLC dungeons, you should be aiming for 25,000 plus. For DLC hard mode dungeons, you should be aiming for 30k plus as kind of a minimum. Combine the use of your skills and passives, reinforced gear, defending one-handed weapon, or resolving vigor for minor resolve to get those resistances up alongside your champion points. The more you block, the less value resistances have because of block mitigation, unless you're receiving damage over time or not blocking. In those cases, resistances play a much bigger impact and a more important role. Next, you want to be making sure that you've got at least 2,000 Magicka Recovery. To maintain all of the uptimes with every class within this build, you need to have a bare minimum of 2,000 Magicka Recovery. Having more is absolutely fine. Some classes can deal with less if they can gain Magicka in alternative ways, so the Dragonknight using their ultimate, for example, or any class that uses the balance skill from the Mages Guild will also be fine as well. But you will struggle to maintain uptimes and survive if you have lower than 2k recovery. When we look at the champion points, there are quite a few that you really need to be looking at. In terms of the green champion points, these are not important whatsoever. The only things you really want to have is breakfall in case there's a mechanic that throws you in the air and you drop down, reducing that fall damage. You also want to have Steed's Blessing so that you move faster out of combat, but those are the only two essential green ones that you need. Now for your blue champion points, there's a range of different options you can go with. The most important ones to get are usually Unassailable, Enduring Resolve, Duelist Rebuff, and then in here you've got Ironclad. Now depending on your situation, you might decide to switch to something else. So for example, Bulwark might be a better option instead of Unassailable, and that is because Unassailable reduces your damage taken by area of effects, and this is, from my personal testing, probably the least valuable champion point out of all of the defensive ones available. So you can easily switch this over to Bulwark if needed. But if you're playing an Arcanist, for example, you definitely won't need it because the Arcanists are already able to reach the maximum on their resistances a lot more easily. Now other essential blue CP include all of the ones Quick Recovery, Elemental Aegis, Preparation, and Hardy are all essential. You've also got things like Precision, you've got your things Eldritch Insight, Tireless Discipline. Over here you've got one as well, Blessed is going to increase healing done, and then on the opposite side you've also got some in the extended might area, so Piercing is something you can get, but then you really want to have Flawless Ritual to increase your chance to apply status effects by 60%. If you want to, you can have War Mage as well, as this is going to increase some of your damage, but if you don't have the champion points, maybe your lower CP, you don't need to get that yet. And then Battle Mastery is another one that you want to get after you've got the other one. So this one's more important, but then Battle Mastery is really good to have after. And then again, if you want to increase your damage, you will go with Mighty. These are unslottable champion points, which is why you would take them. Alternatively to that, maybe you don't need Bulwark and you don't need Unassailable, at which point you might consider using one of the three healing based ones, especially if you are kind of on your own. If you're not there with a healer in a dungeon, then you might need to buff up your own healing. So Focus Mending will increase single target healing by 10%, Swift Renewal will increase healing over time, and your Soothing Tide will increase your AoE healing. So depending on which class you are, if you do need a healing CP, one of these three will be very, very useful. Now looking at your red champion points, the character that I'm currently on is my Arcanist tank for dungeons, and so I'm not using a typical champion point setup. As you saw, I'm not using Bulwark because I don't need it, but like it's the same with the red CP. So generally you want to get Boundless Vitality, that's a really good one to have to increase your max health. In most cases, you would probably use Fortified for most tanks. That will increase your armor by 1731, so that's quite a significant boost. And then a lot of classes would also use Rejuvenation, but I've got so much recovery already, again, because I'm an Arcanist, I don't need either of these two. I've got lots of recovery, I've got lots of resistances, I don't need either of these, which does give me a bit more freedom to use some other stuff. Now, other slottable CP that we've got, some of the main ones down here, so Wind Chaser in this section, you want to go for Celerity, so during ad pulls you want to be using Celerity. If you're on bosses with lots of movement, use Celerity. This is a really good one to increase movement speed by 10%. So next we've got Bracing Anchor, which is another good slottable. You would only use this on boss fights. It does have a movement speed penalty for slotting it, so you don't want to use that during ad pulls, and you don't want to use it on fights where you've got to move around a lot. On bosses where they might do a lot of damage, this is excellent to use because when you block, it's going to reduce the damage you're taking. It's going to push you towards that block mitigation cap of 90%. So block mitigation is capped at 90. This is going to give you 20, so it's a nice one to have for those hard fights. If you didn't want to take the movement penalty and you're on a class like an Arcanist or a Dragonknight or even a Templar and you've got access to a spammable damage shield, then Wardmaster is another option. You don't get that movement penalty, and it's also not block mitigation. This is general damage reduction, so it reduces your damage taken while blocking. So you've got to be blocking and you've got to have an active shield, so something like Igneous Shield for example, and then you're going to get 10% damage reduction. So this is really, really handy because that is just general damage, whereas this is only blockable damage that are affected by block mitigation. So this is another option. For the rest of your CP, you obviously want to take things like Hero's Vigor to increase max health. If you're in a kind of a newer group, having Tempered Soul, return to life after resurrection with more resources. If you are dying, maybe you're new, you're going into a new piece of content, then you want to have this so that you are able to have more resources once you are resurrected, and this doesn't need to be slotted either, so that's a nice one. Other things include Mystic's Tenacity for 25% reduction to status effects, Tumbling, Defiance, and then over here we've got Sprinter. In here we've got that Hasty for that 4% movement. You've got the Tireless Guardian, reducing your block cost by 40. Fortification for even more block mitigation, and then if you want to, if you're using sets like Turning Tide, if you're using gear sets that require you to bash, having that Savage Defense and that Bashing Brutality can also be helpful. Now, specifically because I'm on the Arcanist, I am using Shield Master, which reduces the cost of your damage shield ability by 2% per stage, so 10% in total, and also Bastion, so increase the effectiveness of your damage shield, and that's by 15%. And that is because I'm using a damage shield as like my main survival tool. Now, this would also be very good when you do this with a Templar, although a Templar doesn't have as easy access to things like recoveries and resistances, but it's another excellent option if you don't need to slot the other two I mentioned before. So if you don't need rejuvenation and fortification, these are some that you can consider. Okay, next we're going to be looking at the gear and all the different gear sets we're using and how to use them, what they do, and then like some alternative options afterwards as well. So the first thing we're using is Archdruid as a monster set, and this is arguably the best monster set you can possibly use for dungeon tanking. So you are going to get offensive penetration for the first part, which is not that useful, but then when you deal damage with a heavy attack, after 1.2 seconds you deal shock damage to up to 6 enemies within a 7x5 meter line on your target, applying major vulnerability to them for 7 seconds, increasing the damage taken by 10%, and this effect can occur once every 15 seconds. So all we've got to do is we want to stack our enemies together, we hit a heavy attack, a bear will appear, and it will apply that debuff to the enemies. So it's a very, very strong set to use, and we use that in light armor and medium armor. So you've got to use obviously the helmet and the shoulder, and we use that with 1 piece medium, 1 piece light to give us that 5-1-1 benefit. Now this can be earned by completing the Earthen Roots Enclave on veteran difficulty, so you will need to do that to obtain the monster helmet. The next gear set is Turning Tide. Now again, this one is a very, very strong set. Combined with Archdruid, they provide you with a 100% uptime on major vulnerability. So as we can see here, we've got increased max health, max stamina, max health again. When you block, you gain flowing water for 10 seconds. So you need to block an attack, and then you have 10 seconds to activate the second part of the set. So causing your next bash to deal magic damage to up to 6 enemies in a 5x10 meter line and applying major vulnerability for 10 seconds, increasing their damage taken by 10%. So it is the exact same debuff as Archdruid. This effect can only occur once every 15 seconds. If you alternate the two, that means you're able to maintain a 100% uptime potential. So a very, very good option, and like I say, you just need to block a hit and then you need to bash the enemy, and that will apply the debuff. So you need to be able to heavy attack and you need to be able to bash to proc both of those. This set is obtained from Shipwright's Regret, and it is a heavy armor set, so you are going to be using 5 pieces of this on your main body pieces, so your chest, your waist, your hands, your legs and your feet, to give you that full benefit. Now the next 5-piece gear set is Powerful Assault. This is another really, really good set, and there's 2 different options here. So you will either use Vestment of Olorim or you will use Powerful Assault. Now Powerful Assault is generally the better option, just because if you're kind of doing random dungeons, if you're doing dungeons with a healer, then you're going to use Powerful Assault. Now Powerful Assault will give you max health, max stamina, increased weapon and spell damage, and then when you cast an assault ability while in combat, you and 5 group members within 12 meters gain 307 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds. Now on the flip side to this, Olorim will provide major courage, but you will notice a lot of healers will usually run some kind of gear set that provides the same buff. So you can't use Olorim if there's a healer using a major courage set already, so there's not much point in doing that, which leaves you with Powerful Assault. Now when it comes to the 2 gear sets, Olorim is actually the better set because it gives a bigger buff. Major courage is a bigger buff than Powerful Assault, but also it's much more sustainable to maintain it. So all you've got to do is cast your Elemental Blockade, for example. That will place the Olorim on the floor. Then your group members will need to step into it to get the buff activated to their character. Now the problem with that is, if you're in random groups, if your group aren't very good at stacking in and getting the buff, it's going to be very, very hard to provide it to all of your group. So while it is better for you to sustain, Powerful Assault is the much easier set to activate on your actual group, because this is just based on distance. So as long as they're within 12 meters, it doesn't matter in which direction, then you're going to be able to provide this. You will have to cast assault abilities on a frequent basis, so it's not as good for your sustain, especially because the majority of skills you'll be using will be stamina costing as well, so it can make things a bit difficult in terms of how you sustain your tank build, but it is a very good buff and much easier to maintain than Olorim as well. So this is definitely the set you want to be using. You use it on your jewelry, on the neck, the ring, and then also on your back bar. So the main part will be the eye staff. Now, if you're just getting started out as a tank, then maybe you won't have the eye staff. These are very expensive, sometimes within the millions of gold to buy, at which point you can just use 2 pieces on the body if you absolutely needed to. So if the worst comes to the worst, you could use the jewelry along with, let's say, the hands and the waist. And that wouldn't be the end of the world by setting it up that way, but it just wouldn't be the most beneficial way to do it either. So if you did want to do that, that is perfectly fine. And then the final pieces of gear we've got here are your front bar weapons. Now, pretty much every good gear set for dungeon content can be worn on the body and on the back bar only. You don't need to double bar it. That means you are able to use a weapon set. Now, there are 2 extremely good weapon sets to use. So the first one is the Master's Perfected One Hand and Shield, also known as the Puncturing Remedy set. If you've got it in Perfected from doing Veteran Dragonstar Arena, then you can get 3% healing taken. If it's not Perfected, you'll just get this benefit, which is when you deal damage with puncture, you heal for 6508 health and gain spell and physical resistance equal to the amount of healing or overhealing done for 5 seconds. So the resistances aren't super important unless you time it specifically for like a heavy attack when you can get those resistances, but because it's only 5 seconds, you are better like guaranteeing those resistances in other ways. The healing with this is scaled off your max health, so the more max health you've got, the more healing you get. So basically just by using your Taunt, your Pierce Armor, you're going to be healed. So this is the best option to use when you are fighting bosses. So using the one hand and the shield, that would be the best option. Now the other option is to use the Vateshran one hand and shield instead, also known as the Void Bash set. This is probably one of the most absolutely best in slot must-have sets for dungeon tanking in the whole of the game. Now this comes from Vateshran Hollows, the arena, and you don't have to do it on Veteran to get this set. Just do it on normal if you can't do Vet, and just farm it because you absolutely need to have this. It makes life so much easier to have it. If you do have the perfected version, you're going to get an extra 965 max health, which is nice, but the main part of this is when you deal damage with Power Bash, apply Call of the Void to yourself for 2 seconds, and enemies within 12 meters are immediately pulled to you. This means that you get great sustain, and it means you stack things much faster. So when you're doing ad pulls, you need to be using this for all ad pulls in the game, or on bosses where there's lots of ads as well. Now what you do is you just walk into an ad pull, you activate combat, you wait till enemies are close, you hit your Power Bash, and that will pull everything with one button. Now instead of using Silver Leash 5 or 6 times without using any kind of chain or pull skill 5 or 6 times and using all those resources to pull everything in and do it really slowly one by one, you just press this one button and everything is pulled in with that one press. This means that everything gets stacked faster, it gets killed faster, you can debuff it and control it faster, and it just means that dungeons will be far better if you're using this set. And you can actually do Vateshran Hollows on normal using a tank build. If you look on my website for my Accolade Dragonknight tank or my Spellguard Arcanist build, these are tank builds that are utilised in solo content and group content for like easier content, and you can easily do the normal arenas using either of those builds, so they will help you get through the arena. And if you've got any questions about this, you can also ask on my Discord. So next we're going to look at the traits and enchants of this gear. So as you can see on my body pieces, I am using full Divines, and Divines is going to increase the benefit that we get from our Mundus Stone. So when we use our Mundus Stone, which is the Atronach, it's going to give us more Magicka Recovery, which means we're going to get even more because we're using Divines. And this is a really, really good way to help with your general sustain. Now, alternatively to that, this is a bit kind of swift because I'm on an Arcanist that has really high everything. If you're not an Arcanist, you may want to use some reinforced pieces instead, and that is because you won't be anywhere near the resistance cap potentially, at which point using some reinforced will be another really, really good option. But if you can reach the resistance cap by using champion points, by using a one-hander with defending, by using things like Major and Minor Resolve can come from Vigor. If you're using Powerful Assault, then using Resolve and Vigor is one of your options because that's a way to activate it, but also give you a constant supply of that Minor Resolve buff. In some situations, you may also consider using Sturdy. If you're somebody who is blocking all of the time, then Sturdy is going to provide you probably one of the better benefits because it's going to reduce your block cost. Now you do have to remember, the more you stack block cost, the less effective it is. So you get heavy diminishing returns on cost reduction, all a lot across the board in the Elder Scrolls Online. So you do have to look at it. Try applying some pieces and seeing how much impact it has and see whether it's worth it or not. I have used Sturdy on my Arcanist tank in certain fights purely because I don't need Magicka Recovery. As you've seen, I've got over 4,000 Magicka Recovery when I'm buffed. That's like more than you really need. I've also got maxed out resistances without using any reinforced or defending, so I actually don't need either of those things. So the next best option would be to go with Sturdy. So that is an option if you are a heavy blocker, or if you're in a situation where you're using an Arcanist and you just don't need the other types of resources. For the enchants, you do want to go with them multi-effect enchants, those tri-stat enchants, and that is because when you kind of wear them on every single piece of gear, in total you'll have 2,000 more overall stats than you would if you just used a single kind of thing. So if you just use health, or just use Magicka, or just use stamina, then using a tri-stat will actually give you less of the total maximum of those things, but in total, if you add all your resources together, there'll be 2,000 more. So the best way to get the most impact out of them is to have that tri-stat on all pieces. When we move on to jewelry, there's a couple of different options that you can go with here. So the first option is going with Harmony and Magicka Recovery. Now Harmony is going to give you a lot of resources, especially if you're using 3 pieces. So activating a Synergy restores 880 health, Magicka and stamina. So this is every Synergy. Whatever Synergy you use, you're going to get 880, and then times that by 3 for 3 pieces. This is by far the best trait to go with for your jewelry. The problem is, if you're not getting any Synergies, then it's not as good. But you are able to go from 0 pretty much to full by activating a couple of Synergies, because there's no cooldown on this. You can just keep activating it for every Synergy. And especially in dungeon content, especially if you're with Arcanists and you're with a healer, maybe you've got somebody with Blood Altar, you've got somebody with Orbs, you've got somebody with a Purify, you've got Arcanists putting down their skills with their Synergies as well. There is plenty of potential to be gaining a Synergy. There's lots of different ways to synergize things and then gain these resources. Now, if you didn't want to use that, you can also go with Infused. Infused isn't much difference, actually. This one is just better because you're getting stamina and you're getting health as well. Whereas if you use Infused, it's only going to buff up your enchant. So the enchant, the best one to go with again is Magicka Recovery, and that is because it's going to just give you lots of resources to buff up and allow you to keep casting skills. Now, if you do reach that threshold of sort of 2,500 Magicka Recovery without your jewelry, then you can switch your jewelry enchant to Try Cost Reduction. Now, Try Cost Reduction is going to reduce the cost of your skills, whether they cost Magicka, health, or stamina. The one thing you have to be very careful of is if you're casting skills and then you run out of resources, then obviously it's not doing anything. So cost reduction is only good if you've got enough recovery to overcome everything, so you don't run out. So cost reduction combined with recovery is very good, but replacing one for the other is not. So if you have over 2.5k recovery, then you could switch to cost reduction. Now, cost reduction is going to be very, very strong if you're on a class that uses frequent stamina skills. So if you're on a Dragonknight and you're trying to maintain Stone Giant, then definitely switch to Try Cost Reduction, because you're having to cast Stone Giant once every 5 seconds. That's going to be very useful. When you're on a class with no stamina skills, maybe take the Sorcerer for example, maybe you're not using any stamina skills whatsoever, everything's Magicka, then the cost reduction isn't going to be very useful. You'd be much better off stacking that Magicka Recovery much higher. So number 1 is Harmony with Magicka Recovery, number 2 would be Harmony with Try Cost Reduction, and then the third option would be to switch to Infused with either of those same 2 enchants, depending on the situation. So again, if you're not getting those synergies, then switch to Infused, and it works with both the Magicka Recovery and the Try Cost Reduction. Now for your weapon traits and enchants, there's a few different options here. So I actually switch my weapons for bosses and then switch them for ad pulls. So on ad pulls, I use Vatishran one-hand and shield, and I use defending on my one-hander because I'm sometimes under the resistance cap during ad pulls because I'm not actually doing some things that I would usually do against bosses, because I'm mainly focused on pulling everything in and debuffing it and not so much on the survival aspect. So getting 1,638 extra physical and spell resistance is really good for ad pulls. It means I don't have to block as much. On the shield, Divines. And then on the staff, Infused Crusher. So Crusher is going to debuff the boss, the enemy, by 2,108. For ad pulls, this is not useful whatsoever. I will actually sometimes switch between bosses and ad pulls, and I'll switch my staff as well. So I'll have a charge staff on the ad pulls, and that's going to buff up one of my skills that I'm going to show you in a minute. But on bosses, it's not as essential to do that, but the Infused Crusher is. So for bosses, use that Infused Crusher. For ad pulls, use Charged with any enchant. And then on your weapons, switching over, again, like I said, the Master's one-handed shield there is charged with shock damage. That's going to help me to apply some extra effects to the boss. And then again, the shield is just that divine shield. One of the great things with dungeon tanking is the option to customize your gear and use alternative gear sets depending on your group composition. So I'm going to show you a few different options of gear now, which I might sometimes use myself, or are also good for dungeons, which sometimes might not be useful for trial or other content. But for dungeons where you've only got 2 damage dealers or maybe 3 damage dealers, they do perform very, very well. So in optimized dungeons, you've got a range of different gear sets that perform at a similar level, especially 5-piece gear sets, and you want to make sure you're choosing 2 sets that don't conflict with other things that other people might be wearing. So as we mentioned before, using Olorim, if you've got a healer using Spell Power Cure, you wouldn't do that. But there's various different things you can use that will not overlap and are good depending on your group type. Obviously, we've mentioned the top 3 sets already with Turning Tide, with Olorim and Powerful Assault, but as well as that, the next set you could use would be Pearlescent Ward. Now, Pearlescent Ward will provide you with a damage buff, but also it will give you a survival buff if people in your group are dead. Now, this is a fantastic set to use if you're in a beginner group, with people that maybe don't have very much experience, you have people that die quite frequently, or maybe you're a new tank yourself and you don't want the micromanagement of a gear set like Powerful Assault. So obviously the buff that you get from this isn't as strong as Powerful Assault, but it requires no micromanagement. The set bonus is there all the time, 100% without you doing anything. So this is a super strong set for a lot of players just because of how easy it is to use, while still providing that benefit. And then if group members die, it gives them that buff so that they can help res players without dying because they're much more defensive. Another strong gear set is Drake's Rush. Now, a lot of players frown upon the idea of using this gear set because they just don't understand how good it is. This gear set will give you major heroism, but not only you, your group as well. The reason why this is strong is because people are able to generate their ultimate back extremely fast when they have got both major and minor heroism active. Now, this set is pretty comparable to most other top gear sets. It will provide about a 6 to 8% damage increase depending on group. This is just based on the fact that if people use their ultimates on cooldown and they're able to use them much faster, they're able to do much more damage. So this is a great set, and sometimes you might want to use this for ad pulls potentially instead of just on bosses. You might want to use it for bosses as well, but this is quite a good ad pull gear set because then you can generate your ultimate while you're going through the ad pull. When you get to the boss, everyone's got it, and then you might switch it off for Turning Tide. But like, it's a fantastic gear set that will give you your ultimate back faster, but all your group members as well. But it's got to take, you wouldn't use this in random dungeons because players who aren't using their ultimate on cooldown are not going to have benefit. Like, it's going to be wasted if people aren't ultimating on cooldown, at which point this set does kind of have a few issues. Another really strong set would be Crimson Oath's Rive. This gear set is going to debuff enemies. So if you're with a group who have a lot of medium armor, maybe they're full medium armor, they might not be reaching that pen cap. And reaching the pen cap is pretty important because you do want to get to that stage where you are kind of at the pen cap, you're able to hit enemies for their maximum amount of damage that you can. And so this might be better than some of the buffs just based upon the fact that you're really far off the pen cap. So this is a good set, and it will debuff up to 6 enemies at a time, so quite good. Another gear set is Saxiel Champion. This gear set again is another one that's very good when paired with Pearlescent Ward. It's a very defensive set. It allows you to use different ultimates. It's especially good with a Necromancer, so a Necromancer can equip this set. And then when they drop their Colossus, this will also provide the same buffs as what they would get from a Warhorn. So very good. It also means that if you are in one of those groups, maybe you're in a group of players that are really struggling, you can slot Barrier or a defensive ultimate like Magma Shell. And then when you cast that ultimate, you're still going to provide them with the major force that you would get from a Warhorn, but you're able to add defensive benefits in there as well. So it's a really strong option for newer tanks, newer groups, or groups that are having difficulties. Definitely something worth considering, and especially with Necromancers. And then the final 5-piece gear set you could use would be War Machine. This isn't generally a very good set for general players, but if you're in a group with extremely high damage, then this is a boss set that you could use to go for those insane burns. If you want to really burn bosses to an incredible level, then you could consider using War Machine, as it's going to provide your group with a really nice buff. In terms of alternative monster sets, we've already looked at Archdruid, which is my number 1. Number 2 that you could consider would be Tremor Scale, especially if you don't have other sources of pen. So on an Arcanist you wouldn't need it because you've got things like Runic Sunder which give additional pen, which is about the same value as what you get from Tremor Scale. If you're in a group with full medium armor users, maybe they're only a little bit off the pen cap, Tremor Scale could step in and would be a really good option. It's very good for groups that need it. Another option would be Nazare. I don't feel like Nazare is quite as strong, but Nazare will help you to maintain uptimes on certain debuffs, especially if you have struggled with doing so. Things like Minor Brittle, things like Major Maim, and various other really short duration debuffs. You can apply them to the enemy, you can hit your ultimate while you've got Nazare, and then they'll extend their duration, sometimes by quite a huge amount. So this can be very, very strong if you are somebody who particularly struggles to maintain those debuffs for long durations of time. Then you can use the benefit of Nazare combined with using up a lot of ultimate to give that extended duration. Symphony of Blades is another one that you might want to use if you're in a group with no healer. You might be the one who has to provide this because your group are struggling for sustain, so it can be really strong for your group. The problem is that you don't get the benefit of it if you're wearing it, but you will provide that, and you'll also need to slot a skill that will heal your group members to provide that buff. So it's not easy to use, but it is a set that might be useful in some groups. And then finally, you've got Engine Guardian, which is a set that you could use if you are brand new to tanking and you're really struggling for resources. The last thing is a mythic item that you could use, and this is very good for ad pulls especially. I tend to use this instead of Archdruid when I'm in ad pulls, just because sometimes Archdruid is just not effective. But it's the Spulder of Ruin, and you would combine this with a one piece of Magma Incarnate or another similar kind of monster set that will provide you with additional recovery. Now, Spulder of Ruin will just be a nice easy buff that you can give to your group, so you just crouch to turn it on, and then anybody who stood inside the aura will get the benefit of the increased weapon and spell damage. So it's fantastic to use, it's really easy to use, similar to how Pearlescent Ward is a super easy gear set to use. This doesn't require you to do anything other than turn it on, and then it's just active. The downside to this is you will lose some recovery. Thankfully, in a dungeon situation, it won't be very much recovery because you've got far fewer people than you would in a trial. So it's only a little bit of recovery lost, which is mostly negated by using that Magma Incarnate to get your recovery back. So we've seen the optimized build. The actual build that I use, I am in a dungeon group where we run twice a week, and we've been doing all of the dungeon trifectas. And one of the main builds that I do use for that is a 2-piece Archdruid with a 5-piece Straight Rush, a 5-piece Powerful Assault, and then I switch between Void Bash and Puncture and Remedy on my weapons. Some alternative builds you might want to use something like 2-piece Tremor Scale with a 5-piece Pearlescent Ward and a 5-piece Powerful Assault, again with the Punch and Remedy or Void Bash. A very simple build to run if you just want something nice and easy would be Pearlescent Ward 5-piece with a 5-piece Saxseal Champion and a 2-piece Engine Guardian. Or you could use the Spulder of Ruin with that, and if you just follow the suggestions for traits and enchants on all of those, then all of those options would be very, very strong options in various different situations. So next we're going to go through all of the skills and passives. Now there are many different options we can use here. We've got setups for PC players where you're going to have an ad pull setup and then a boss setup. I'm mostly going to go over the static setup, which will be useful for console players, and we've also got a more beginner friendly setup as well. So you'll see those on the screen. I'm going to go over the main setup and go through like all the details of what the skills do, but then you can utilize those other options based on the class you're playing and the different situations that you're in. So firstly, we are going to look at the Arcanist. Now the Arcanist is the main that I play currently for dungeon tanking, and then let's just go over all of the skills and passives. We're going to start off with an ad pull setup for this. And the first skill we've got is Runic Sunder. So you craft an apocryphal rune, you deal damage. The rune steals 2,200 armor and applies Minor Maim for 15 seconds, reducing the enemy's damage done by 5%. What this means is when it steals armor, that means that you gain 2,200 resistances when you use this on an enemy. So it's really good for ad pulls, and because it's a ranged skill as well, it's a good way to kind of instigate combat. The rune also taunts, and it generates crux as well, which is really, really nice, while slotted damage taken is reduced per active crux, so a nice little passive benefit. The next skill we've got is Race Against Time. So this is going to give Major Expedition, it gives Minor Force, it increases movement speed by 30%. That is the main reason why I use this for ad pulls, is because I want to stay ahead of my group and I like to get ahead. Activating this also removes snares and immobilizations, so it stops you from being snared and slowed down, and it just means you can zap through those dungeons as quickly as you can. The next skill is Impeverous Rune Ward. This is a fantastic skill for survival. You're one of your main survival tools for an Arcanist. Like the Rune Knights of old, summon a shield that absorbs 33,423 damage for 1 second, and then 16.7k damage for 5 seconds if the first shield persists. Both shields scale off your max health. The first time you take direct damage, the shield retaliates and deals damage back to the attacker, and it scales off your armor. It consumes crux to heal you for 4783 health, scaling off max health per crux spent. So because it uses crux to heal you, this is a huge tool for survival. So if you think about it, we're not going to be using any other crux skills apart from this one. So this one skill is going to heal us for 4,783 times by 3. So it's a nice big heal as well as a humongous damage shield. So it's a really strong skill. Next we've got Rune Guard of Stillwater. So for dungeons, this is the better morph of this skill. So you cast forth a complex rune granting you and your group members minor resolve. So you're going to buff up your group as well with extra resistances. After 1 second, the spell weave immobilizes enemies for 3 seconds. So this is one of your crowd control skills that you're going to use after you've pulled enemies in. You gain minor protection as well, reducing your damage taken by 5%, and the first time you're damaged while below 50% health, minor protection is consumed to heal you for 14k health when it scales off your max health. So this skill does so many different things. It's going to give you and your group minor resolve, so extra resistances. It gives you minor protection to reduce your incoming damage. It's going to be an automatic heal when you're low on health, and it's also going to immobilize enemies. So it does 4 huge useful things for dungeon content. So it's just an absolutely fabulous skill, and like I say, you want to use this after you've pulled enemies in. Next we've got Power Slam, and this is basically to proc Void Bash. So you're going to be using the Vatishran one hand and shield. You go into an ad pull, you hit Power Bash or Power Slam, it's going to pull everything in. That is the only reason why we use this, is just to chain everything in. The ultimate on the front bar is Gibbering Shelter or Gibbering Shield, whichever morph you like. You're not really going to use this. This is purely because by having this slotted, it's going to help increase your stamina recovery, your Magicka Recovery, and your health recovery from one of your passives. If you just want to focus on Magicka Recovery, then Barrier will provide more Magicka Recovery, but if you're trying to focus on all 3 recoveries, this is the better option because it is going to add that extra bit for all of them. So that is the way to look at it. If you are going to be focusing, if you're not going to be blocking all the time, if you are going to be generating some stamina recovery, then use Gibbering Shield or Gibbering Shelter. If you want the Magicka Recovery instead, then go for Barrier. On the back bar, we're going to use Frost Pulsar. This is for ad pulls, don't forget. And Frost Pulsar is a fantastic skill once again. So it's going to do frost damage. It's going to do minor mangle, which reduces enemies' health straight away by 10%. It also provides minor protection for the group. And what it doesn't mention here is it's going to apply minor brittle and minor maim to the enemy. The reason why we use this is for the status effect. It has triple chance to apply a status effect. And that status effect is chilled. When we get that, we're going to get minor brittle, and it's going to be as an area of an effect minor brittle as well, which is really nice. So it's going to increase the damage that enemies are taking. It also means that they've got minor maim, so they're doing less damage. So when we chain everything in with Void Bash applies major maim to the enemies. This is then going to apply minor maim, so enemies are doing 15% less damage straight off the bat, as well as taking more damage, as well as our group taking less damage because they've got a minor protection, and then the enemies have got less max health because of the minor mangle. So a really useful skill to use for ad pulls. Next we've got Razor Caltrops, and this is to proc Powerful Assault. We're assuming you're using Powerful Assault for this build. If you're not using PA, then this is still a great skill. So you're going to throw this down on the ground and it's going to snare the enemies. It's going to reduce their movement speed, and this helps you to control the battlefield much easier by having that there. It also covers a very huge area and applies Major Breach. So because you don't have time to go around and stick Pierce Armor on every single enemy, it's just easier to apply Major Breach instead as an area of an effect. So while enemies are stood on top of this, they will be debuffed and your group will be doing a lot more damage to them. So it's a really integral skill. Next we've got Blockade of Frost, and this is again a really valuable skill, and it needs to be combined with Pulsar to get the maximum value out of it. So the bottom bit here, chilled enemies are afflicted with minor breach and their movement speed is reduced by 40%. So the way we're going to obtain this minor breach is by putting down our blockade. Enemies are stood inside of it, we cast Frost Pulsar. That is pretty much going to guarantee that chilled effect, especially if you're using a charged Ice Staff for ad pulls. And then we're going to get access to minor breach as well. So that's why Pulsar is doing so much, because now it's also activating minor breach as well as the major breach we've got there, so enemies are severely debuffed and much easier to kill. Another little benefit as well is the damage shield that we get, so a 13,873 projectile damage shield. This can be quite helpful for ad pulls again, because you might have enemies that are at the back end of a room and they're shooting at your allies, so when you cast this on the ground, they're going to get a bit of a damage shield to protect them against that. Next we use Crux Weaver Armor, and this is your main armor buff. It's going to give major resolve. It also applies minor breach to enemies as well. So most other classes don't have this. So most classes will rely on what we just mentioned by putting down Blockade and Pulsar. The Arcanist doesn't need to as much because they have Crux Weaver Armor. So while this is active, and when enemies hit you, you're going to apply minor breach to them, which is just really helpful, because it's another way to gain access to that debuff in case it fails in the other methods. You also get Crux generated by using this skill, so that's really helpful as well. And then obviously we get all the passive benefits alongside that. Next we've got the Rune of Uncanny Adoration. So this is used purely because it is a skill that will pull enemies in. So you can't rely on just having a skill that will pull everything. So Void Bash sometimes won't quite catch every single thing in a room depending on the room size. At which point we use Rune of Uncanny Adoration. The difficult part is the range on it isn't great compared to things like Silver Leash. Now the reason why this is much better than Silver Leash is because when you cast it on an enemy, they will run around and do absolutely nothing for 8 seconds. So if you've got some really tough adds that do really high damage, you apply this to them, they're going to run into the stack, they're going to come towards you because they follow you wherever you go. They're also not going to do anything other than walk after you for 8 seconds. Now on top of that, we're also going to get minor vulnerability for 10 seconds, which increases the damage that enemies take by 5%. So this is basically your chain skill. It's not quite as reliable as maybe a chain that is faster, but it is going to be meaning that enemies don't do any damage, and it's also applying an extra little debuff. And then finally we have got Aggressive Horn, which is obviously really useful for your group, providing extra stats and also major force. Now when we switch over to our boss setup, you might see we've got now PS Armor on our front bar. Now you don't essentially need this, you will have to look at your particular group's uptime on major and minor breach. I did notice myself that I wasn't getting enough minor breach uptime from my other skill that provides it. So obviously we mentioned before, Crux Weaver Armor applies minor breach to enemies. I wasn't getting a high enough uptime on some bosses, especially bosses that do infrequent attacks or maybe really long-winded mechanics, then you don't have a high enough uptime. So Pierce Armor for me was still a skill that needs to be used, but it's also very much needed, or else the Master's Sword and Shield won't work. You won't be able to use the Master's One-Hand and Shield without Pierce Armor. So there's a couple of reasons there to use this, but it's not essential if you look at your own uptimes and see that the uptimes are fine. So this is mainly there because it's a taunt and it's providing major and minor breach. Next we've got Xena's Empowering Disc. Now I took this off for ad pulls because I just don't have enough time personally in ad pulls to put this down along with doing everything else. So pulling everything in, debuffing it, doing everything there, and then by the time I've done that, the ads are usually dead, so I don't have enough time to place down this, but this is a really strong skill for bosses especially. So standing in the vortex grants you and your allies minor courage, minor fortitude, minor intellect, and minor endurance. It increases weapon and spell damage by 215, and your health, magicka, and stamina recovery by 15%. This is really strong because it's replacing the need for anybody to use Yolnahkrin in a dungeon. So it's basically replacing a gear set. A 5-piece gear set is replaced by a skill. So that's super good because you've essentially equipped an extra gear set on an Arcanist tank by having this skill. Unbelievable. These effects also stay on your allies for 10 seconds after they leave the vortex, so that's really good as well. So you want to place this down for your group to stand in, and it's just another buff that you're able to add. Again, we use Impeverous Rune Ward. Very useful. You want to cast this just before you take a heavy attack from a boss, just before a big mechanic, and it's going to be your main survival tool. You also want to make sure you've got Rune God of Stillwater active at all times on bosses. It's still there again because it's a really useful skill. And then we've still got Runic Sunder, but this is more of a flex slot now. The reason why I've still got this is because it steals 2,200 armor. That is almost the same as an Infused Crusher. It can basically replace you needing something like Tremor Scale. So if you're thinking, maybe I'll put on Tremor Scale because my group don't have enough armor pen, but you can just use Runic Sunder because 2,200 combined with Major and Minor Breach and all the other sources of pen and your Crusher is going to pretty much put you right next to the pen cap. So this is a great skill. It's also good for you to buff your armor, but it is another taunt, so it is kind of conflicting in the fact that it is another taunt and you might not need it depending on the way your group's set up. So it's a flex slot. There are other skills we'll go over in a moment that you could use there, but that is just there if you need it. Again, you would use Gibbering Shelter on your front bar for the extra recoveries. On the back bar, you'll now see Frost Clench. Now, Frost Clench is more important on bosses because using Pulsar isn't as valuable on a boss fight because half of the things don't necessarily work. With Frost Clench, you add a range taunt, you still get that chilled effect with the minor brittle and the minor maim, but you also apply major maim to bosses. So on fights where you've got really hard mechanics, you might have some things like that. I know there's a few in some of the newer dungeons where it's really high damage. You hit them with Frost Clench to reduce their damage by 15% straight away. And that is a really good survival tool for those harder fights. By using this as well, what it also means is we are going to be using this as a kind of a spammable skill. Because that Major Maim only lasts for 5 seconds, and a lot of our skills are really long duration. If you look, 30 seconds there. We've got 10 seconds of minor vulnerability on this one. When we look in our front bar, this one's 20 seconds, 6 seconds, 20 seconds. So a lot of these skills have got quite long durations. So what you're going to be doing is, Frost Clench is going to be almost a spammable skill to cover you by using the other morph of this skill. So Rune of the Uncanny Adoration is still going to be used for bosses because you can't change the morph during a fight, and you're still going to need this for boss fights to pull in some of the ads. The other morph would generally be better, especially in trial content, because it applies a really super long duration minor brittle, but you're not going to need that in dungeons because you can almost spam Frost Clench because you've got such long duration abilities. It allows you to do that, so you do not need to go with the other morph for dungeon content. On bosses, I still use Razor Caltrops on an Arcanist, and this is because there's no point in switching to Resolving Vigor because we've already got minor resolve, so we don't need that. But if you wanted to, you could switch this to a different assault skill. If you're not using powerful assault, then you could switch this to something altogether. But I like to still use this on bosses because sometimes you will get a lot of ads and other things on boss fights as well, so it still is useful for that AoE major breach. On boss fights, Blockade of Frost becomes useful for a completely different reason. We're not really using it now for that minor breach from the chilled effect. We now use it because it's a way for us to maintain our back bar enchant 100% of the time. And for boss fights, we should be using an infused crusher, and by keeping down Blockade, it will automatically keep proccing that enchant, and so we don't need to worry about it. We can just put this down and leave it, and the boss will be debuffed just the whole fight. Obviously, we also use Cruxweaver Armor, and we also use that Rune of the Uncanny Adoration, and again, we would use Aggressive Horn. In terms of alternative skills, if you are struggling for sustain, you could use Recuperative Treaty, and this is just going to give you an extra bit of resources. I have tried it out. It works in some places better than others, so it's something you could use if you are really struggling, but you shouldn't be having too many issues. If you are, slot this instead, and that will be really helpful. For the passives in the Herald of the Tome section though, there's only one that you really need to have. It's Fated Fortune. When generated or consuming Crux, it increases your critical damage and critical healing by 12%. So we're not going to use it for the crit damage per se. It's mostly there because 12% more crit healing is a really nice thing to obtain. The other ones you can and should pick up later when you've got more skill points, but they're not essential to start with. For the Soldier of Apocrypha, obviously we've got every single skill being used from this skill line because they're all very useful and they've got so many things combined, but it's the passives that make them even better. So the first passive is going to give you an additional buff of armor, so 1980. This is why the Arcanist can reach that armor cap so easily, because we've got this passive, we've got this skill that steals armor, we've got so many ways to get additional armor. Next you've got Wellspring of the Abyss. So it increases your health, magicka and stamina recovery by 129 for each Soldier of Apocrypha ability you have slotted. So that's why we slot that Gibbering Shield on the front bar for the extra 129 of all of those recoveries. We do try to split these skills up a little bit, so as you can see I've got 2 of them on the back bar, and then on the front bar we've got quite a few. So we've got 516 recovery on the front bar from that passive, and then on the back we've got 258. So it's a very strong passive, giving us a ton of additional resources. Next we've got a group buff. This is going to give a group buff of minor evasion for 20 seconds. So every time we cast an Arcanist ability, it's going to give us minor evasion for 20 seconds, and we can reactivate it once every 5 seconds. So we're reducing AoE damage by 10%, and it's also for our group. So that's a really nice little buff to have to improve our group defense. And then we've got a bit of an ultimate passive there, so when you consume Crux you gain 4 ultimate. This effect can occur once every 8 seconds. So every time you cast Impeverous Rune Ward, the damage shield, that is going to use the Crux to heal. It's also going to use the Crux to gain ultimate. On the curative rune forms, extra skills you could use here. So Glyphic is another really useful ultimate. If you are using Saxiel Champion, if you're doing a really hard fight, maybe you switch one of your sets, maybe you're too far out of range. I have done some dungeon fights where my group aren't close enough to me to benefit from Powerful Assault, so I've switched out to Sax and then used Glyphic instead. Now both morphs of Glyphic are pretty good. You've got Glyphic of the Tides. This one requires you to heal it. If you're a tank with no healer, this one's not going to be very good because you're not going to be able to heal it up, so that one wouldn't be good. If you've got a healer in the group, definitely take this one because this one is going to be the better version. If you've got damage dealers only, then this would be the better one again because you've got to deal damage to the Glyphic and then it's going to give them a buff. So they're going to get 200 weapon and spell damage, which is really, really nice. It's also going to heal your group members. This one also adds the additional effect of providing your group with major protection to increase their defense even more. So if you want to add in a bit of extra survivability, then Glyphic of the Tides, especially if you've got a healer in there, is going to be really useful to get your group through some of those harder mechanics. Another good optional skill is Chakram Shields. So Chakram of Destiny is the one I prefer, and this is just basically, if you think about it in a similar way to how Igneous Shield is on a Dragonknight where it provides that group shield, this does a similar kind of thing. It will give a group shield to people in front of you. It is quite intensive on resources though. It's going to cost you 3,000 stamina, which is the main problem because it stacks based off your highest max resource. And because your highest max resource is likely to be stamina, it's going to be quite hard to sustain this one because it is going to be using a lot of stamina to give that group shield, but it's something you could use if you wanted to add in an extra damage shield for yourself and your group. And then you've got Cascading Fortune, which is a bit of a heal. It's heal per second. Again, it's stamina, so it's not great, but it is going to be a nice little heal if you needed some extra healing for whatever reason. The passives from Curative Rune Forms, again, are really, really strong. So Healing Tides increases your healing done by 3% for each active crux. So as we've mentioned already, we're going to build up 3 crux, and we've only got one skill that uses up crux, and it is a healing skill. So we're going to have an extra 9% healing done when we've got that skill ready and we've got those crux active. We've got another one here based around crux, so whenever you generate crux, you restore 225 Magicka or stamina, whichever maximum is higher. So every time we generate crux, we're going to get 225 stamina. So it's a nice little extra way to recover some resources. This one is another huge one. So we've already got massive gains on our recoveries from the Soldier of Apocrypha skill line and passives. And then when you look at this one, increases your Magicka and stamina recovery by 18%. This is how we get to over 4k recovery without even really trying. It's because we've got this combined with the other passives, which is just absolutely crazy. Finally, we've got this one. So with a Curative Rune Form ability slotted, reduces the cost and increases the strength of your damage shields by 10%. So this is why we slot Xena's Empowering Disc on the front bar. This is going to buff up the Impeverous Rune Ward skill because we've got it slotted on the same bar. So we use that on the same bar, reduces the cost of that skill, and it also buffs it up as well. So that is why we do that. So depending on your bar space, depending on the situation, there are a few different other skills you could use on all classes to kind of affect different things and change the way you play in. You've obviously got Heroic Slash, which could give you minor heroism, so that can be sometimes useful. Maybe not, it depends if you're using heroism potions, it depends if you get enough ultimate. Generally, it doesn't get used as frequently nowadays, but it is still pretty decent for that minor heroism if you need it. We've also got passives on the Sword and Shield, and you basically just want to take everything because they've all got a lot of use when it comes to tanking, so you should always just take all of these. When we next look at the Destruction Staff, every single Destruction Staff ability is useful for tanking. So again, these are very situational, some of these. So Crushing Shock is used for ranged interrupting enemies, so they might be casting something and you want to get an interrupt. So this is very useful for doing that. So you need to have this skill available just in case there are mechanics where you need to ranged interrupt. So next we've got Elemental Susceptibility. This is going to apply Major Breach, which you might not need. It depends on how you're setting up, but it also provides Burning, Chilled and Concussion status effects. So this is a way to increase your group's DPS by increasing your uptimes of your status effects, especially Chilled and Concussion, because that's going to apply Minor Brittle and Minor Vulnerability. So it's going to increase your group's DPS. So it's a really good skill to use if you've got the bar space, if you really need it. It really depends on how you set up. For your passives, I take everything apart from Trifocus. We don't take Trifocus because we do not want to block with Magicka. That is absolutely something you do not want to do. Penetrating Magic is an optional one, and then Elemental Force, Ancient Knowledge and Destruction Expert are all essential passives. If you're light on the passives, you do want to take the first 3 because these are going to provide benefits even for a tank, and then later on when you've got more skill points, take the other 2 as well, but the first 3 are the most important ones to increase your resistance for spell damage, your Magicka Recovery and cost reduction, and then also reduces snares and the cost of sprint speed. For your medium armor, the first two and the last one, so obviously the first one increases critical damage and healing done, so obviously critical healing is always useful. Windwalker, it's stamina recovery and stamina cost reduction, and then athletics is increases the movement speed bonus to sprint and reduces the cost of dodge roll. So again, all very useful. You can take the other ones after, not essential to start with. Heavy armor passives, obviously you take all of those because they all provide benefits, and because you're going to be using 5 pieces of heavy armor, there's absolutely no reason not to use them. Things like Constitution are very useful because you are going to get a lot of resources, so you restore 108 Magicka and stamina when you take damage for each piece. So all you got to do is be hit and you're going to get 541 of your resources back. And then we've got things like Juggernaut, increasing max health, and Revitalize as well. For your guild skills, the only really useful one here is Silver Leash. This is obviously a way to chain in enemies. It is quite resource intensive, it costs stamina. It's kind of annoying because when you compare it to other options, it's nowhere near as good, but it is very quickly. It will also taunt enemies that are not taunted, so if it is needed, then you must take that. And you also want to combine that with Intimidating Presence because this reduces the stamina cost of fighters' guild abilities by 15%. So you have to take this passive if you are using Silver Leash. On the Mages Guild, depending on the class, you might want to use Balance. So when you use Balance, you use health and you trade it for Magicka. Nowadays we can obtain so much Magicka, this is not as essential as it used to be, but like if it's something that you struggle with particularly, then you can use it. And it is still a strong skill. It will provide you with Major Resolve as well for 30 seconds, so that is really good. Getting that nice chunk of 3000 Magicka is good. You do get a small healing debuff for 4 seconds where you take 50% less healing done and damage shield strength. So that can be a bit of an issue if you're dealing with high damage situations, but it is still really useful. And when you take that, you obviously want to take especially the 3 middle passives, so you do get access to a bit more stuff there, reduces the cost of your Major Guild abilities, increases the duration, so obviously that's why we get 30 seconds of Major Resolve, and then also that increased Magicka and Magicka Recovery can be nice as well. For the Sigil Corder, you've got Temporal Guard. Now some classes might use this, the Arcanist in particular doesn't need it, but others might. This will give you minor protection, reducing damage taken by 5% just by having it slotted. Obviously we've already mentioned about Race Against Time for a speed boost, and it's a really good skill as well. When you do have those skills, having the Clairvoyance passive to reduce the cost is useful, and Concentrated Barrier as well to give you a damage shield basically when when you're blocking and you've got a skill on your bar. For the Undaunted skills, there's a few useful ones here. So Overflowing Altar is really good if you don't have a healer in your group. So if you're the only person, if you're the only support in your group for dungeon content, you're probably going to need to use this because it's going to give your group minor lifesteal, so they're going to get constant little ticks of healing. And then it's also the main thing, which is the Synergy, which is going to be a 65% heal of their max health. So when they get low health, the Synergy appears, they can press that, and then they can do a nice big heal. You won't get that Synergy yourself, however, which is a little bit of an issue, but this is something that you do need to have available for those dungeons where you don't have a healer. Inner Beast is another kind of interesting skill. It will add a bit of damage to your build, and it will also apply some different effects now. It's been changed recently. It's got a 28 meter range. It costs stamina, ignite the fire of hate in the enemy's heart, dealing physical damage, taunting them to attack you. It applies minor maim and minor vulnerability for 15 seconds. An allied target in the enemy can activate the Radiating Synergy, dealing flame damage to them over 3 seconds as well. So the other morph for this is a Magicka morph as well, but it doesn't have as many of effects. So that is something you can consider using if you wanted to add those extra things in there. If you don't have a way to get minor vulnerability and minor maim potentially, then you could slot this. Again, it'd be conflicting because it's another taunt, so it's up to you. I'm probably not going to really use it, but it is an option. We've also got Energy Orb. As we mentioned before, if you don't have a healer in your group, maybe you want to provide some additional resources and a little bit of healing for your group. So you will use this and it will float around and it'll heal every 1 second. It will also provide a Synergy which people can use to get their resources back. It will explode and heal, and people will get Magicka or stamina back. So it could be used, it can be useful on a Warden as well when they're trying to proc their maturation passive and things like that. So if there's certain gear sets that you're using, if you're using Symphony of Blades, for example, you might be using that for whatever reason. This Energy Orb is going to be vital for helping you to proc that. So that is an option. For your passives, you definitely want to have Undaunted Command and Undaunted Metal. Especially with using Harmony Jewelry, you've got to think your Harmony Jewelry is going to be buffing up your Synergies already, but then also Activating this energy restores 4% of your max health, stamina, and magicka. So 1,913 health, 811 stamina, and 634 magicka. So another stack of additional resources, and there's also no cooldown on this as well. And then Undaunted Metal is just going to give you an extra buff to your max resources because we're using that 5-1-1 setup. This is one of the reasons why we do that, is because it's going to give us 2% per armor type, and because we're using all three, we're going to get 6% increased resources. As I mentioned earlier, we've got Resolving Vigor in your alliance, and this is going to be something you might use on bosses instead of caltrops, and it's because after casting, you gain minor resolve, increasing your physical and spell resistance by 2974 for 20 seconds. Some classes have access to minor resolve quite easily already. This is another way to obtain it if you don't have an easy access to it, and it's also a heal over time. The problem is it does cost a bit of stamina, and the stamina has been increased now, so it is a bit more expensive than using caltrops. For your support spells, you've got a couple here. So you've got Efficient Purge. This is a very expensive Magicka skill which is going to remove negative effects from you and your group. There are very specific mechanics in certain dungeons where this can be used to remove certain dots or bleeds or effects from you, and it will be vital to do that. It does not work in a lot of situations though. There's a lot of dungeons where they affect you with some kind of bleed and it just cannot be purged, and that's intended because there is a purge skill in the game and they don't want it to be cleansable. Another really useful skill is Revealing Flare. This is probably one of the go-to skills if you're going into a dungeon that you've not done before, if you've not experienced certain mechanics before, maybe you're finding a particular dungeon really hard, then definitely consider using Revealing Flare. This will give you a 100% major protection uptime. So you're just going to slot it on your bar and you're going to have access to major protection. So reducing your incoming damage by 10%. You don't need to morph it because both the morphs don't do really anything for PvE. It's just there to be slotted for that major protection. And it's a really useful skill. Very, very good for those hard dungeons, especially when you're struggling or maybe you don't know the mechanics and if you're dying a lot. Now what you want to do with that is you want to combine that with your Magicka Aid passive. So if you are using Replenishing Barrier, that's going to give you 10% more Magicka Recovery. If you also had Revealing Flare, that's going to stack that up to 20%. So the more of these skills that you're using, the more benefit Magicka Aid is going to provide you. So especially, like I say, if you are using Barrier, if you are using Revealing Flare together, make sure you've got 2 points into Magicka Aid. That is going to give you a huge amount of additional recovery. Okay, so that was everything for the Arcanist and general tanking and passives. Now we're going to look specifically at the Dragonknight tank, and this is just a kind of general bar setup, a static bar setup. So if you're a console player, if you just want a static bar setup, that is what we're going to show you now. If you would like something more detailed for ad pulls and bosses, those are going to be on the screen as well, but we're going to go over all of the little skills and things that you could use. So for a Dragonknight, you are going to be using obviously Pierce Armor for your Major Breach, your Minor Breach, and your Taunt. The next skill you would use is Stone Giant, and this is to provide a group buff, and this is a flex slot where you can slot in something different if you wanted to. So if there's a different buff, if there's a different skill you'd like to use, this is where you're going to put it. So Stone Giant is there because it applies stagger, so it increases the enemy's damage taken by 65 per stack for 6 seconds, and this can be stacked up to 3 times. So this is going to be a nice little group buff. When you think about dungeon situations though, this is only going to provide, like if you've got 2 damage dealers, you might be getting a 4 to 6k damage increase for your group, so a very, very minor detail. If it's 3 damage dealers, add another 2, 3, 4k on top of that. So it's a very small benefit. So you just got to remember that it's not as vital as it is for trial content because the benefit you're given is so tiny in that smaller group content. But it is a group buff, so if you've not got anything else to do, then you should be trying to maintain some kind of buff or benefit for your group. Next you got Igneous Shield, which is going to provide you with a damage shield. It's going to provide your group with a little bit of a shield as well. You're going to get Major Mending, and every time you cast this, you're also going to get stamina back from your passives. So this is such a great skill that it's a must-have for dungeon content. Next you got Green Dragon Blood, which is your main heal. So you want to use this when you're at a low health as possible. You don't want to use it when you're really high on health because you'll get much less of a benefit. When you get low on health, you cast this, so ideally under 50%, and then you're going to get a nice burst heal. It's also going to give you a heal over time, as well as giving you Major Fortitude, Major Endurance, and Minor Vitality. So you're going to get increased health and stamina recovery by 30%, and you get increased healing received. So it's a really, really strong skill. It's got lots of different things in there that are going to buff up your character. Obviously, you would need to use Power Slam. That is just to proc your Void Bash set. Obviously, when you're not using Void Bash, you'll switch this out for something else. And then you use Replenishing Barrier for that Magicka Aid passive to give you increased Magicka Recovery. On the back bar, Frost Clench for the Taunt, the range taunt, the Magicka taunt. It also gives you that major maim, the minor maim, and the minor brittle. So it's got a lot of things packed into that skill that makes it very, very useful. Then you've got Razor Caltrops for the powerful assault proc, the AoE major breach, and the snare as well, so a bit of crowd control. You got that elemental blockade, which is going to proc your enchant on bosses, especially. It's going to give you that crusher. It's going to be used on ad pulls to get that minor breach against chilled enemies, so that's really good as well. Then you've got balance, which is used because the Dragonknight does have quite expensive Magicka skills, so balance can be really good, but you can also use the other skill that we'll show you in a second. And then you've got Unrelenting Grip, which is a taunt skill. It's a chain skill. It pulls enemies in. It gives you a speed boost when you use it against things like bosses or elite enemies. If it doesn't chain anything, it refunds the cost. If you cause the burning effect while using this, you'll restore Magicka back. So it does quite a lot of things, which is really, really nice. Then you've also got Aggressive Horn to provide that group buff. Now, other skills and passives that you could use for the Dragonknight, you've got Engulfing Flames, which is a group buff, once again. The problem with this now is they've changed the formula, so it needs to be stacked off your weapon or spell damage. What that means is the current value in the bottom corner there says 2% out of a maximum of 6, so it's not quite as effective now to use it as a tank as it used to be, unless you can stack up your spell or weapon power really high. It's also not that effective in some groups if they're not doing any kind of flame damage, so it's only good if you are with allies in your group that are doing some kind of flame damage, at which point Engulfing Flames can be a good group buff. On your passives, you've got the Combustion passive, so it increases the damage of burning and poison status effects, but that's not why you use it. It's when you apply burning or poisoned to an enemy, you restore 1000 Magicka and stamina, and this effect can occur once every 3 seconds. So by spamming chains, you can get back 1000 Magicka and stamina once every 3 seconds. So when you're on a boss, you could do that to get a ton of resources back. Combined with the fact that we've got other passives that are going to do a similar thing where they restore stamina. So in reality, you've got no excuses now for running out of resources, especially stamina, on a Dragonknight, when you can use skills like Engulfing Flames, like Unrelenting Grip. You can even use Burning Embers if you wanted an additional heal, although it's not that great of a heal. It's still going to apply flame damage, it's still going to give you a bit of a heal, and it's potentially going to apply that burning effect, which is going to proc your combustion passive. The Warmth passive isn't that essential, but it is something you could use, especially when you've got more skill points. Searing Heat is only useful when you are using things like Engulfing Flames or Burning Embers, because it's going to increase the duration, so it's only useful in that situation. If you're not using those skills, you don't have to get this, because it's not really going to do anything. And then the World in Ruin passive as well is not essential, something you want to get in the long term but not needed at the start, because it's just buffing up your damage. On the Draconic Power skill line, so if you didn't want to use Balance like we mentioned before, because you don't want that health cost, you don't want to deal with that reduction in your healing done and damage shields, then you could take Hardened Armor instead. This is going to be Magicka costing, it's quite cheap. It's also going to give you that major resolve, the same as Balance, but you're also going to get a damage shield on top of that. So a 10,000 damage shield for 10 seconds, it scales off your max health, so the more health you've got, the bigger the shield. It's also going to return some damage to the enemy as well, which scales off your physical and spell resistance. So this can be a good alternative if you don't want to go with that one. If you've got plenty of sustain already, then you don't need Balance, then definitely consider using Hardened Armor instead. Another good option is using Choking Talons. So as this is a static setup, if you didn't want to use Stone Giant and maybe you need some extra crowd control, then you could just use Choking Talons on your front bar instead. So you can chain everything in with your Power Bash, cast your Choking Talons to root them in place, make it a bit easier for your group. So Choking Talons will root enemies, immobilizing them for 4 seconds, and it will also apply minor maim, and then it will also provide a group synergy which they can use to apply more flame damage to the enemy as well. We've got Protective Plate, which is not that useful in too many places inside dungeon content. It will reduce your damage from projectiles by 50%, which can be quite handy in situations where you've got a lot of projectile damage. There's very few of those situations, as I say, in dungeons. You also gain immunity to snares and immobilizations, which can be really helpful in specific situations where those things happen. Another very situational skill is Deep Breath. This is basically just an AoE interrupt. So if you've got more than one enemy that needs interrupting, maybe you're not fast enough at doing it, Deep Breath, hit them with it, and they'll just get the interrupt from that instead, which is really useful. For your passives and Draconic Power, Iron Skin increases the amount of damage you can block by 10%, obviously always going to be good. Burning Heat, while Draconic Power ability is active, your healing received is increased by 12%. So obviously if you've got Green Dragon Blood, which is giving you minor vitality, increasing healing received by 6%, and then you've also got an additional 12% there, you're getting a lot of extra healing received by being on a Dragonknight. Elder Dragon's going to increase your health recovery, which isn't that particularly useful, but it's a nice little extra tick of healing every 2 seconds. And then Scaled Armor is going to buff up your resistances. On Earthen Heart, we've got a really strong option here with Magma Shell. If you're in a situation where you're about to die, maybe you're in a really hard fight, maybe you want to try and skip some mechanics even, Magma Shell is going to help you do that. You're going to provide a damage shield for your group, but you're also basically going to become unkillable. So limiting incoming damage to 3% of your max health and dealing flame damage to nearby enemies. So you just can take almost no damage for that 12 seconds, and it's just an incredible ultimate for overcoming really hard fights, or like I say, just being able to skip through mechanics or skip past certain things that maybe are too difficult, maybe things that you're not supposed to skip past but you can because you use Magma Shell. So it's a really useful option to have for your ultimate in those situations, and it could be used alongside something like Sax Champion. So if you really wanted to go down that route, maybe you don't want to use a Warhorn, you could use Sax Champion, use Magma Shell, and then you're still able to give the buff of the Horn without needing to use it. One of the other group buff skills is Igneous Weapons, so it increases your group's weapon and spell damage by 20%. Gives major brutality and sorcery. Now the problem is, people are probably going to be using potions that provide this, so it's not useful when that is the case. The way that you make use of this is, if you're in an organized group, you get your group members to use different potions so that you can use this skill instead. So that is a possibility. You could also use this in things like random dungeons where you don't know whether your group are going to be using potions, so then it's going to guarantee that they are getting that benefit, because some people might not use potions. Like, it's not a guarantee. When you're doing a random dungeon with random players, there is no guarantee that they're going to be using potions at all. So by giving this buff, you're going to make sure that they are doing the maximum damage that they're capable of. Another useful skill might be Cinderstorm. Now in most cases it would not be that useful, but if you're in kind of, again, if you might be in a more beginner group, or maybe you don't have a healer, maybe your healer's not very good, you can throw this underneath yourself to give yourself a heal over time. So it works quite nicely because it gives you a heal over time, and then it means that you don't need to keep wasting loads and loads of magicka on the burst heal of green dragon blood. So you just use this instead, and it gives you a nice tick of healing. And it's a very cheap cost as well, so 344 magicka per second. Now if you've got jewelry on that reduces the cost of abilities, this is going to get reduced even more, to the point where it might be almost free or potentially even free to cast. So in that case, you're going to get a nice heal, and it's not really going to cost you anything. And then the passives on the Earthen Heart side of things are some of the strongest in the game in a lot of ways. So Eternal Mountain increases the duration of the Earthen Heart ability, so that's good for things like obviously Igneous Shield. It's good for that Cinderstorm. Battle Roar is where it's all at. So when you cast an ultimate ability, you restore 50 health, magicka and stamina for each point of ultimate spent. So if you cast a 250 ultimate, that is a lot of resources that you're going to be gaining back. This is one of the things that becomes a bit of a crutch later on. So if you ever switch away from a Dragonknight, you become so reliant on Battle Roar and just using your ultimate on cooldown, getting so many resources back, it actually sometimes can become hard to play other classes because you just don't have the option of ultimate use to then gain your resources back. It's such a strong passive, and one of the real key benefits to playing a Dragonknight. You've also got Mountain's Blessing, which is going to provide a group buff. So when you cast an Earthen Heart ability, you and your group members gain minor brutality for 20 seconds, increasing weapon damage by 10%. And if you're in combat, you also generate ultimate. So obviously now that Igneous Shield spam is increasing our ultimate gain, and then it's also giving us the Helping Hands passive. So when you cast an Earthen Heart ability with a cost, you restore 120 stamina. This effect cannot activate when using stamina costing abilities and must cost more than the restored value. So it's not going to proc off Cinderstorm, but when you're using things like Igneous Shield, if you're using it on a regular basis, you can spam this to get a damage shield, to get yourself that major mending, to get yourself 1120 stamina, and to get yourself ultimate. So it's going to compact a lot of things into that skill, which is really, really nice. Okay, next one to the Necromancer, and again this is going to be just a static bar setup. We're not really going too much detail, but you can find those on the website and on the screen now. So for the Necro, again, we start off with Pierce Armor for the Major Breach, the Minor Breach, and the Taunt. We've then got our Flex slot. This is where you want to slot anything that you need. So again, we've got a particular skill here, Agony Totem, and this is like a crowd control skill, but it's not that effective. So we are going to use multiple things to get the same benefit. So like a Dragonknight can use Choking Talons, Agony Totem doesn't match that because it won't work against enemies that have been chained, because this is a fear. So you cannot use a fear after you've used a chain, but you can use an Immobilize afterwards, but unfortunately the Necro doesn't possess a useful immobilization skill. They do have one, but it doesn't work because you have to be facing the enemy and it works in a really strange way. Whereas like Choking Talons, Gripping Shards, they are around the character, and unfortunately this one isn't. So with Agony Tome, the reason to use this is because it's going to give minor protection to you and your allies, reducing damage taken by 5%. It is going to fear enemies. Maybe when you go in, the melee enemies that you're not going to chain are going to be feared, so that's going to be good to stop them from doing anything. It's also going to provide minor vulnerability, so it's going to apply that to enemies that are inside the area, meaning they're going to take more damage by 5%. But this skill could be switched around if you don't need it. The next skill is Necrotic Potency, one of my most favourite skills in The Elder Scrolls Online. It saps the life from corpses, granting you 6 ultimate and healing you for 1401 health every 1 second for 2 seconds per additional corpse. This ability scales off your max health, and while slightly your damage taken is reduced. So it's a really, really wonderful skill. Reduced damage by 3% is only a small buff, but it's something. And then the heal is nice, especially when you've got a lot of corpses, but the biggest reason for this is because you just get that ultimate gain. So every time 1 corpse is worth 6 ultimate. So you can gain so much ultimate, especially during ad pools and boss fights where there's lots of ads, by creating your own corpses. Necrotic Potency is an unbelievable skill, and it's like a must-use skill for me because it just means you can just keep ulting so fast, and it's one of the main perks of playing on a Necromancer. The next skill is Hungry Scythe. This is your main healing skill, so you get a nice bit of healing from this, but in some situations if there's not enough corpses it's not going to do anything, so you do need a heal. Hungry Scythe is going to do damage to the enemy. It's going to do like an AoE hit. It's going to heal you for the first enemy hit, and then additional health is going to be restored based on the amount of enemies hit as well. You're going to heal every 2 seconds over 10 seconds as well. On top of that, all healing is scaled with max health, so this is a nice skill. It can be a bit difficult though, because if you're not next to an enemy you can't heal with it, so you do require to be close to enemies to heal, and that can sometimes be a bit of a problem. Power Slam once again, because you need that for the Void Bash set. If you're not using this, then you're not going to be able to use Void Bash. If you're not using Void Bash, then obviously this becomes a flex slot where you can slot another buff or another skill instead. Then we've got Replenishing Barrier for that Magicka Aid passive to give us the extra Magicka Recovery. On the back bar, it's pretty much the same as every class. You've got Destructive Clench, the Frost Clench, to get that Taunt, the Magicka Taunt, the Range Taunt, the Minor Breach, the Major Breach, and the Minor Brittle. Razor Caltrops for the Powerful Assault proc and that AoE Major Breach again, and the Snare. The Snare is extra useful on a Necro because you don't have good crowd control, so snaring enemies is just like an alternative option to crowd controlling when you don't have the access to an immobilization. Elemental Blockade for that nice little damage shield and to proc our back bar enchant. Then we've got Beckoning Armor, which is your major resolve skill. Now this is extra useful because it will chain in ranged enemies. So when they hit you, they'll be chained in, and they'll also become taunted. So it's really, really good because it's going to be a great skill to use. You can basically just range taunt enemies from around the room by using Destructive Clench, and then leave Beckoning Armor to automatically pull them all in. The only downside to Beckoning Armor, it'll only pull things in once every 2 seconds, so it can be very, very slow, which means you do need to use Silver Leash, which is not a great skill to use. This is a chain skill, it pulls enemies in and it taunts them as well. The alternative to that is you could just drop Silver Leash and just stick with Beckoning Armor. It's going to be expensive to do that, but you would just need to make sure you've got everything taunted with Destructive Clench, and then every time you chain an enemy in with Beckoning Armor is recast it, because you can actually use this every 1 second as long as all the enemies are taunted and they're hitting you, and then when they hit you, this is active. But the main thing is you should be using Power Slam to pull everything in, and there should only be 1, maybe 2 ads maximum that didn't get pulled in, at which point you range taunt them and then you use Beckoning Armor, so you shouldn't need Silver Leash. So Silver Leash is just there as kind of a backup, but you shouldn't absolutely need it. Finally, you've got Aggressive Horn again for that major force buff for your group. Now in terms of other skills and passives, Glacial Colossus is definitely something you could use instead of Warhorn if you wanted to. It really depends on your group setup. Often Warhorn is the better option because the buff you get from Colossus is Major Vulnerability. This is covered by Turning Tide and Archdruid. Both of those sets already provide it, so you don't need it. But the thing is, you might want to switch your setup. So the Necro in particular is really good with Saxiel Champion, combining that with the Colossus Ultimate, and that is something you could do as well. Now, this is the option that you want to go with, Glacial Colossus, because it's a much longer duration, so this will apply Major Vulnerability to the enemy for 17 seconds, increasing the damage taken by 10%. It is also going to stun enemies with the final hit, and it's going to apply frost damage. So this is the one I prefer, and that is just an optional ultimate that you could go with if you wanted to. The next skill we've got is Blighted Blastbones. Now, what's important for a Necro is creating your own corpses. When you run an ad pull, there's already corpses there. You use Necrotic Potency, and that will absorb the corpses. Now, on a boss fight, when you don't have maybe ads or other enemies, you're relying just on your own corpses. And when you look through your skills, we've only got this one skill, Beckoning Armor, that's going to create a corpse. So when you are on a boss fight, you might consider using Blighted Blastbones. Now, it does cost stamina, which makes it a little bit trickier now because the other morph doesn't provide that anymore. It's going to buff you up, and this is something that's going to cause damage. So I do prefer the damage option. But when you use this, it creates a corpse, and it does so very quickly, which you can then use Necrotic Potency for a heal and to get that ultimate gain. So it's an optional thing that you could do if you wanted to. Another thing to do is use Boneyard. So we've used Caltrops. If you're not using Powerful Assault though, you might want to still provide that AoE Major Breach, in which case you could use Boneyard. Now there's two options for Boneyard. You've got Unnerving Boneyard, which is going to provide that AoE Major Breach on the ground, which reduces enemies' spell and physical resistance. That's really, really good. You also provide a Synergy for your group, which is nice as well. So that is the usual option. Now in some rare cases, you might want to create your own Synergy, and if you want to do that, then Avid Boneyard's there as well. But generally, the Unnerving Boneyard is the much better option. Another skill you could use for a corpse is Skeletal Arcanist, a Magicka costing skill. You create a Skeletal Arcanist and it will attack the enemies for you, and then once it comes to an end, it will create a corpse, so another corpse creation skill. Now with this skill, and the same with Beckoning Armor, when you cast them halfway through their duration, they will create the corpse. So as you can see here, Skeletal Arcanist is a 20-second duration, but if you cast it after 10 seconds, it will create a corpse. So this is a good way to create additional corpses if you want them, and also add a little bit of extra damage. Next you've got Mystic Siphon. Generally I'd use a different Siphon ability than this one, but this one is going to cause shock damage. It's also going to restore health, Magicka and stamina recovery while siphoning the corpse. So by adding that extra recovery in there is something that some Necros find quite useful. Adding that bit of shock damage is something that you might want to do. In terms of passive, Reusable Parts is a really strong one. So when one of your summons dies, the cost of your next summon is reduced by 50%. So that can be really, really strong as well. And especially when you are trying to create corpses by using the summon abilities that create corpses. Death Knell, so it increases the crit strike chance against enemies under 25%. Death Knell is a damage buff which you can take later on, but it's not essential to begin with. Same with Dismember, it's going to increase pen, not essential to start with, so take it eventually, but you don't need to begin with. And then the same with Rapid Rot. On Bone Tyrant, we've already covered all of these abilities here. Grave Grasp is the skill that does give that immobilization, but it's only enemies in front of you, and it summons 3 patches. It's really awkward to use, something that I wouldn't recommend generally, but if you really, really wanted an immobilization skill, then you could use that. For the passives, Desk Gleaning. Whenever an enemy you are in combat with dies within 28 meters of you, you restore 666 Magicka and stamina. This is such a great sustain tool, and this is why you want to be making sure you're doing as much AoE damage as possible with things like Caltrops and Blockade. Make sure you tag every enemy. Make sure they're all tagged so that when they die, you might not be the one killing them, but as long as you've tagged them, then you are going to get that 666 Magicka and stamina, which is really going to be vital for helping you to sustain. This Staying Harm reduces the damage you take from damage over time abilities by 15% while you have a Bone Tyrant ability active. So one of the most essential things is, this is one of the things that really makes the Necro stand out, is their ability to withstand damage over time because of this passive. They are superior at dealing with dots against bosses that really have high dot damage, and it's easy to maintain this passive just by keeping up your Beckoning Armor. So you have Beckoning Armor active, that's going to keep the Staying Harm active, and that means you're going to take reduced damage. This one is going to give you increased healing received for each Bone Tyrant ability, which is a nice little buff to have, and then finally you get increased max health as well. On Living Death, a really, really great option for ultimate if you are in a group, well, if you're doing random dungeons or you're in a group where you're practicing something new, or maybe you're not very good. Renewing Animation, it's just fantastic. You can resurrect basically a whole dungeon group from absolute death and then bring them back so that you don't wipe. Because you can resurrect 3 allies, as long as they're close enough together, you use this skill, you resurrect them all, and then you can carry on going. So it can be a really good way to get through some of the harder dungeon content. Maybe when you're doing it for that first time and it's really difficult, it's definitely a great option. Expunge and Modify is basically another way to purge yourself. So depending on how things are going, you could use this. It's not a really essential skill, but you'll purge negative effects from yourself. It costs health and it will restore magicka and stamina. So it's a nice little skill, and while slotted, the cost of all abilities are reduced. So it does quite a few things. It's not very often used, but I have seen it used in like very certain situations, and it can be quite useful. Another great skill, so as I mentioned before, some of these skills here, so you could drop Agony Totem for something like Spirit Guardian. Spirit Guardian is a fantastic skill. It conjures a ghostly spirit to you, and it'll be by your side for 16 seconds. The spirit heals you or the lowest ally. This is the bit of annoying part, is sometimes it will heal somebody else and not you. But it's nice to have it in a group, especially if you don't have a healer. While active, 10% of the damage you take is transferred to the spirit. So the spirit will absorb some of your damage. So this is again where that dot damage comes into effect. So when you are using that Death Knell passive to reduce your dot damage, you've got your armor buff active, you've got your Spirit Guardian active. Your Spirit Guardian will absorb some of that dot damage, and the dots will be initially reduced. So that's what makes them so strong. And this will also create a corpse, meaning you'll be able to get some ultimate from it. Mortal Coil is the one I prefer rather than that Mystic Siphon we mentioned before. Mortal Coil will siphon the last remains of life from a corpse, and it will heal you over 12 seconds, and then everybody between you and the corpse, like every ally between there, will also get healed. It will also restore 170 magicka and stamina every 2 seconds. So you don't get recovery from this, you just get straight up magicka and stamina. So this is like the nicer option in my opinion, and this is the one I much prefer. And then while slotted, you get healing done is increased by 3%. So it's a nice little one for extra sustain. If you're struggling for sustain, try slotting Mortal Coil as an extra bit of a buffer to help you out. On the passives here, when you have a negative effect on you, your healing done is increased by 8%, so you might as well take that. It's a great thing to have if you are dealing with negative effects. Increased healing done is always great. Near death experience is really good as well, so while you have a living death ability slotted, your critical strike chance with all healing abilities is increased by up to 20% in proportion to the severity of the wounds. So on your front bar, you want to have one of these skills if you can, because your main heal's on your front bar, so there's no point having it on your back bar. So we've got here Hungry Sight, that's your main heal. You've also got Spirit Guardian, which is a heal, and it's going to provide you with that passive. So if you are low on health, you should be able to heal much better because it's going to give you buffed up healing if your wounds are severe, thanks to having those there. Corpse consumption, so when you use an ability on a corpse, you generate 10 ultimate, and this effect can occur once every 16 seconds. So you're going to be doing that anyway with your necrotic potency, so that's just going to give you a little bit of extra ultimate on top of that as well. And then Undead Confederate, while you have one of your summons active, your health, magicka and stamina recovery is increased by 200. So just by having your Spirit Guardian active, you're going to increase your recovery. So that is a very good one as well. On to the Nightblade next. And for our kind of standard setup, we have first got that Pierce Armor again for the Minor Breach, the Major Breach, the Taunt. Then we've got Siphoning attacks. So this is kind of changed recently. So Siphoning attacks is, in my opinion, the better option now. So it's going to cost health to cast it. Channel a portion of your soul to convert health to stamina and magicka. So it's a really good sustain tool. And then it says, while slotted on either bar, your soul yearns for the warmth of life. All damage you deal heals you for 1288 health and restores 200 stamina and magicka up to once every 1 second. So it's a great way to get additional resources on a Nightblade. And it makes them really easy to sustain. You just activate this skill, make sure you're doing some kind of damage. You've got to be active though. If you're not being active, if you're not actively casting skills, if you're not actively doing light and heavy attacks, you're not going to be gaining any benefit from this skill, so you're going to get much less resources back. But it is very good for making sure you got incoming resources. Next we've got Lotus Fan. This is going to make you teleport to the enemy, but the main reason why we use this is because it's going to provide AoE minor vulnerability. So it will just hit everything in the vicinity, so you're going to teleport in, use that skill, it's going to debuff the enemy and make them receive more damage. So it's a nice little buff there for your group. Next you've got Dark Cloak. This is your main heal. It's a bit unfortunate because it's a heal over time. It's not a burst heal. So you shroud yourself in protective shadows to heal for 1775 health every 1 second over 5 seconds. So this does increase with the more max health that you've got. And you also get increased healing by 150% when you are not moving. So for a tank in PvE situations, this skill is going to be very, very good because you're just going to get that increased healing a lot of the time. So in dungeon content, you're not always having to move a lot, so you can kind of stand still, you can activate, you can get a nice big heal, and then while slotted on either bar, you gain minor protection as well. So you get reduced incoming damage, which is really, really nice. Then you've got Power Slam to proc your Void Bash set, and it's really important to use Void Bash on a Nightblade because they don't have access to a cheap pull skill. And then you've got Replenishing Barrier for the Magicka Aid passive to give you that increased Magicka Recovery. On the back bar, you've got that Destructive Clench, that Frost Clench for the Taunt, the Magicka Taunt, the Ranged Taunt, the Minor and Major Maim, and then the Minor Brittle as well to increase the amount of damage they're taking, to decrease the amount of damage they can do to you. So that's really nice. Razor Caltrops to proc your Powerful Assault and to give you that AoE Major Breach. And also, again, because the Nightblade doesn't have access to any good crowd control skills, the snare from this is extra important to give you some kind of crowd control, some control of the enemies when you're going into those ad pulls. Elemental Blockade to proc your back bar enchant more reliably. And then you've got Mirage there, which is a nice busy skill. It's going to give Major Evasion and Minor Resolve, reducing damage from AoEs by 20% and increasing your physical and spell resistance. And then while active, taking damage reduces the cost of your next dodge roll by 10% up to a maximum of 100%. You're going to get discounted dodge rolling by having this skill active as well. And then you've got Silver Leash as your main pull skill and chain, alongside Aggressive Horn for that major force buff for your group. Now there's a lot of things you can actually do to change your Nightblade to make them a lot stronger in terms of on boss fights. If we first look at some of the passives on Assassination, Executioner, so when an enemy dies, within 2 seconds of being damaged by you, you restore 1000 Magicka and Stamina. Really important to have this, and also really important again to make sure you've got those AoE skills like Elemental Blockade and Caltrops down, making sure you're hitting all the enemies so that when they die, you're going to get that nice resource gain. Pressure Points is going to increase your weapon and spell crit rating. Now this wouldn't typically be useful, but you need it because for the Hemorrhage passive, this is a group buff. This is one of your very few unique group buffs, which is dealing critical damage grants you and your group minor savagery, increasing weapon crit rating by 1314. Very dependent on the group type you're in. So if you are going to provide weapon crit, you are going to need to be doing crit damage, and so you also get 10% crit damage from this skill as well. Master Assassin isn't really needed, so you don't need to pick that one up. On your Shadow skills, this is where we get some interesting stuff. Bolstering Darkness could be used as a slottable if you need extra max health. So you're going to slot this and then you'll get extra max health from your passives. Refreshing Path is really, really strong for ad pulls, and it can be quite good on bosses sometimes, so you are going to put this down on the floor. It's going to grant allies in the area Major Expedition, Minor Endurance, and Minor Intellect. So you increase movement speed by 30%, as well as giving Stamina and Magicka Recovery. It also heals every 1 second, so this could be a way for you to heal yourself and heal your group as well. So this is something you could use on bosses, or when you don't have a healer in your group, you can slot this on the ground. Now it doesn't stack too well when you are a tank, it doesn't work as good for a tank, but it's still some extra healing that you can provide anyway, as well as the increased recoveries. Mass Hysteria. Now it's weird because I wouldn't use this skill on ad pulls, so it's summoned to Dark Spirit to terrify all nearby enemies, causing them to cower in fear for 5 seconds and be afflicted by Major Cowardice for 12 seconds, reducing their weapon and spell damage by 430. This is one of the skills that makes the Nightblade one of the best defensive classes in the game. You can go into a stack of enemies, use Mass Hysteria and really debuff them, in combination with your other debuffs, to make them do very little damage. Now this will work on bosses. Even though you can't fear a boss, you can still apply the Mass Hysteria, the Major Cowardice, to a boss. So you're going to reduce a boss's weapon and spell damage by 430, and that's where I prefer to use this, is on a boss, use this to debuff them, combined with the debuffs you get already. So Destructive Clench, for example, is going to do Major Maim and Minor Maim, then you've got Major Cowardice, and then we can also gain Minor Cowardice as well as topping up our own benefits of having Major and Minor Resolve, and then things like Major and Minor Protection. So you are able to get such reduced damage on a Nightblade, it's incredible. But the fear doesn't work, because if you're going to chain enemies in, which you're going to need to do in dungeons, you can't fear an enemy that's been chained, which makes this really irritating for ad pulls, because you don't have an immobilization for ad pulls that you can use to really get a good crowd control going. So this is only really good for bosses. For your passives here, increases your health, stamina, and Magicka Recovery by 15%, really, really good. We've got Shadow Barrier. Now, what this means is you actually get automatic Major Resolve from a Nightblade. So casting a Shadow ability grants you Major Resolve for 6 seconds, increasing your physical and spell resistance, and it's increased per piece of heavy armor. So depending on how many heavy armor pieces you wear, you'll get this increased in duration. And when you're casting Dark Cloak, it's also basically going to give you Major Resolve as well as everything else. So it ends up being quite a strong defensive skill. Dark Vigor is going to increase your max health by 3% for each shadow ability slotted. That's why I said before, if you do Bolstering Darkness, if you've got Dark Cloak and Refreshing Path, if you wanted to stack up max health for a specific fight, then this could be a way to do it, because you're going to get that increased max health from that passive. And then Dark Veil increases the duration of non-invisibility based shadow abilities, so basically all of them when you're playing as a tank. On Siphoning, we've got a couple of skills that you could use here. So Swallowed Soul is another skill that isn't necessarily used or useful all the time, but you are going to do damage and then heal yourself based on the amount of damage that you've done. So 35% of damage you cause is going to be healed back to you. So that is really good, but it's also useful for proccing some of your passives. The other skill is Power Extraction. So as we mentioned with Mass Hysteria, that's going to give Major Cowardice. This is going to apply Minor Cowardice. So when you go up to an enemy and cast this, it could be ads, it could be bosses. When you hit an enemy, you gain Major Brutality and Sorcery, Minor Courage, increasing your weapon and spell damage by 20%, and 215 for 30 seconds. And then enemies hit have Minor Cowardice applied to them for 10 seconds, reducing their weapon and spell damage by 215. So we're able to get access to Major and Minor Cowardice on a Nightblade and just remove as much damage that enemies can do as physically possible. The only downside to this is it being a stamina skill, but it does give a nice little buff if you wanted to reduce enemy damage. Now, some of the really strong passives here, we've got Catalyst. After drinking a potion, you gain 20 ultimate. Obviously, potions have a 45-second cooldown, which makes this a little bit tricky because it's not as good as something like Necrotic Potency on a Necro, but it is good all the same. One thing you can do is you can change your jewelry enchants to be infused potion cooldown and then use this much more frequently, and that is a nice playstyle potentially if you wanted to get more ultimate gain on a Nightblade. Magicka Flood is going to increase your max Magicka by 8% with a Siphoning ability slotted. Increased healing done can be nice as well because you are reliant heavily on healing over time, so having increased healing from healing over time. So having increased healing done can be useful to buff up that healing over time. And then you've got Transfer, so casting a Siphoning ability while in combat generates 2 ultimate. And that effect can occur once every 4 seconds. So Transfer can be used really well alongside Swallowed Soul because you're not going to spam this every 4 seconds, but Swallowed Soul is a skill you might cast every 4 seconds. So again, for more ultimate gain, you could use Swallowed Soul for the increased heal and then to help with the Transfer passive. Now we're on to the Sorcerer tank, and again we're looking at the base kind of bar setup you could go with, and we've got that PS armor for the Minor Breach, the Major Breach, the Taunt. We've got Silver Leash, which is in a weird location compared to other classes because the Sorcerer is a particular annoying class because of the pet. And the pet is generally quite important for the Sorcerer as well. So Silver Leash is the chain skill. And then we've got Dark Deal. So Dark Deal is a Magicka skill, and it's going to restore 8,000 health and 3,600 stamina instantly with an additional 2,400 stamina over 10 seconds. So it's really, really nice. The exchange also grants Minor Berserk and Minor Force for 10 seconds, which isn't as important for us. But the main reason you would use this is it's going to activate one of your passives and it's going to give you the resources. The major downside is the cast time. Most skills that are used by tanks always have a instant cast time. This one is a 1 second cast time, meaning for 1 second you cannot block. So this is a very risky skill to use against bosses, especially when you're running out of resources, because you will need to time the use of this skill or else you could end up dying. If a boss is about to heavy attack you and you cast it, you are going to die. So you have to be very, very careful about when you use this skill. Next we've got the Clan Fear, which is basically your main heal, and it's a very strong heal as well. So you will summon a Clan Fear and it will do damage to enemies. It will fight along your side. Once summoned, you can activate the Clan Fear special ability. So when you recast the Clan Fear, once it's alive, it will use Magicka and heal for 10,000 to you, and then the Clan Fear will heal for 5,000. And this will scale off max health, so this will be much higher when you're fully buffed up and in combat. Next you've got Power Slam, which is to proc your Void Bash set, which is very much essential because you don't want to be using Silver Leash because it's got a huge cost associated with it. So you want to be using Void Bash and you're going to need Power Slam to activate that. Then we've got Replenishing Barrier for the increased Magicka Recovery on your front bar. 10% more Magicka Recovery is really good. When we switch to the back bar, we've got Destructive Clench, that Frost Clench for the Taunt, Range Taunt, and it's also going to give us Major and Minor Maim alongside Minor Brittle applied to the enemy, increasing the damage that they're taking. We've then got Razor Caltrops to proc Powerful Assault alongside the AoE Major Breach and the Snare. Again, the Sorcerer doesn't have great crowd control skills, so Caltrops is quite useful for that Snare to get some control of the enemies. Then we use Frost Blockade to activate our back bar enchant mostly. We have to double bar the Clan Fear, which is unfortunate because if we don't, it will de-summon when we bar swap, and that is not great. And then you've got Boundless Storm, which is going to surround yourself with electric. You're going to do shock damage. You're also going to have Major Resolve when you've got this active. And then you're going to get Major Expedition, which is really useful for ad pulls. Now, maybe on boss fights you would switch this to balance, but that's really dependent on if you're able to sustain your Magicka or not. And then finally you take Aggressive Horn to give your group that major force. When we look at alternative skills and passives, we have got Crystal Weapon. So this is a group buff, basically, but a very tricky one to activate. So you are going to use this to remove 1000 armor from the enemy. So it's basically a pen skill, the same as sort of PS armor. It's going to add on top of that, so an extra 1000 pen basically, so your group can do more damage. But as I say, it is quite tricky to maintain this and to keep this up, so most players wouldn't bother doing it, and for the sake of just 1000 pen as well, it's quite a tricky one to do. Shattering Spines is a updated skill for this patch, and it's something you can use. If you know enemies are going to be in front of you, this is a potential immobilize skill, but it only works to enemies in front of you. If there's enemies behind or to the side, it's not going to do anything. But the reason why this is quite good is it will immobilize enemies, it will do damage when it ends, but also enemies hit are affected with Major Maim. So it could be something that you could use, but you will already have Major Maim on ads. When you pull them in with Void Bash, that already applies Major Maim, so that's not really useful. The Immobilize is the main reason you use it, but it's not very good to use. Another skill that's been updated recently is Daedric Refuge. Again, this isn't something that you're going to be wanting to use very often, but you can do this to provide yourself with a damage shield and to provide your group with a damage shield. So if there's a reason why you might need to give a group damage shield, you use this to place Daedric wards basically, and it will put it on the ground, people walk onto it, and then they will get a shield. So it is kind of nice, but you might not find a whole lot of use for it, but in situations where there's loads and loads of damage, it's something that could be used. For the passives, Unholy Knowledge reduces the health, magicka and stamina cost of your core combat abilities by 6%, extremely useful. Then we've got Blood Magic, so when you hit an enemy directly applied dark magic ability, you heal. So you don't really have too many of them. Crystal Weapon is one of them, so you can probably go without this unless you are using Crystal Weapon. It says direct ability, so it's not super useful, but something you could use if you are using one of those skills. Then you've got Persistence. After blocking an attack, your next health, magicka or stamina ability costs 15% less, so make sure you cast in an ability after you've blocked to get that nice little bit of cost reduction. Exploitation is your group buff, one of your main group buffs on the Sorcerer, so when you cast a dark magic ability, you grant Minor Prophecy to you and your group, increasing spell crit. So it's like the opposite of the Nightblade, which provides weapon crit, this provides spell crit, so it could be useful if you're in a group which requires that. On Daedric Summoning, we've got a really nice skill here with the Atronach, and the reason why you might potentially use this is because it's going to do shock damage, it's going to do a lot of damage, it's going to apply the concussion status effect as well, which is going to make enemies take more damage via the minor vulnerability. But then also, an ally near the Atronach can activate the charged lightning synergy, granting nearby allies major berserk for 10 seconds, increasing their damage done by 10%. So you could use this ultimate if you wanted to provide the major berserk buff for your group. If you wanted to use it with something like Sax Champion, that could be really strong. And then obviously if you've got things like Turning Tide as well, so you've got a lot of effects active at the same time, and you're able to do a lot of damage with your group, that could be an option for the Sorcerer. The Twilight Matriarch is another skill you could use. This is where you don't have a healer in your group, or if you're using a gear set that requires you to heal to proc it. This isn't going to provide a huge heal because you're not a magic damage dealer, but you are going to be able to do some healing with it, so it's going to provide a bit of a heal for people in your group, which can be nice. A really strong skill is Regenerative Ward. So if you're not needing to use a certain skill, maybe you can drop that there, you can pop this on instead. On a boss fight, for example, you might be able to switch your Power Slam out. If you're not using Power Slam, like if you're on a boss fight, you might not need that, so then you can use Regenerative Ward. So it's going to give you a damage shield for you and your pets. It's a big damage shield as well, 10,000 damage shield for 10 seconds. And it heals you, grants minor intellect, minor endurance to you and nearby allies for 10 seconds. So it's buffing up your group, giving them increased recoveries, it's giving you a heal, it's giving you a damage shield, it's doing a lot of stuff. And it scales on max health or magicka as well, which means it's going to be super strong for a tank. Another strong skill is Bound Aegis. This is super strong for its passive ability, so while slotted on either bar, your max magicka is increased by 8%, and you have minor resolve and minor protection. so increased resistances and reduces the damage taken. So it's a great skill for bosses. So again, if you didn't need to use some of these skills, definitely slot this for boss fights because you're going to get that increased damage reduction. But when you activate the skill as well, when you block and you have this active, you get an additional 40% block mitigation. And what this means is you can easily get to the 90% block mitigation cap, meaning you'll take the least amount of possible damage you can while blocking against an enemy because you're able to reach the cap of block mitigations. And it's a really, really strong thing against really big, heavy, hard-hitting attacks. For the passives here, rebate, you restore 200 magic or stamina when one of your abilities ends. That's not a ultimate, and so that's nice to get that extra bit of resources back. Reduces the cost of your ultimate by 15% is always a fantastic passive to have. Increases your health and stamina recovery by 20% while you have a Daedric summoning ability slotted. So we're going to get that very easily because there's lots of these that are useful. And then Expert Summoner increases your max health by 10% if you have a pet active. That's the likely chance because we are going to have a pet. If you don't have a pet though, you do get increased max Magicka and stamina by 10%. On Stormcalling, there's not really too many useful skills here. Ball of Lightning is an optional skill, very, very niche. But what happens is you can teleport to a new location and this will absorb projectiles, which can be really, really cool when it's needed. If there are lots of projectiles hitting you, you can teleport away. The Ball of Lightning will absorb them, and that's really cool. The main passive that you need here is Capacitor, so increase Magicka Recovery by 10%. The other ones are not as useful to begin with, and they're stuff you should take later down the line when you have more skill points available. Moving on to the Templar now, and we've got, once again, Pierce Armor for that taunt, Major Breach, Minor Breach. Then we've got Repentance, which is a mega strong skill for a Templar. Basically, when you've got enemies on the ground, unlike the Necro that gets ultimate back, the Templar doesn't, but it does gain some nice benefits. It gets 3,000 health and 3,000 stamina for each corpse. So this will actually heal allies as well. So it's not just going to heal you, but only you will get the stamina. So that's the only downside. This did used to provide stamina to group members a long time ago, which made it very overpowered, but now it's just to you. So you will heal people, but then you also gain minor fortitude, minor endurance, minor intellect, which increases your recoveries as well by having it slotted. So that's really, really good. Next we've got Living Dark. And this is mostly used to proc your main group buff, but also it is going to provide a nice little bit of a heal for ad pulls. So you envelope yourself in a lightless sphere for 12 seconds to protect yourself. Anytime you take direct damage, the sphere lashes out at the attacker, reducing their movement speed by 40% for 3 seconds and healing you for 2,066 health. These effects can occur once every half a second. So the healing is one of the main reasons why you use this. So every half a second you're able to get a nice little heal when you are hit. So that does provide a good benefit for the Templar. Next we've got Radiant Ward. Now it's similar to the Arcanist in a way where the Arcanist is relying heavily on damage shields to survive. The Templar in some ways is the same, but it's nowhere near as strong. So surround yourself with solar rays, granting a damage shield that absorbs 9,439 damage for 6 seconds, and this scales with your max health. It will also deal damage back to the enemies, and it's, like I say, one of your good survival skills alongside Living Dark. So you have to combine a few things together to improve your survivability with the Templar. And then we use Power Slam to proc Void Bash set because we have to, because we don't have a good reliable chain skill that isn't going to ruin our stamina. And then we use Replenishing Barrier for that Magicka Recovery once again. On the back bar, Frost Clench for the Major Maim, Minor Maim for the Taunt and for the Minor Brittle. Razor Caltrops. Once again, we don't have a good crowd control skill with the Templar, so we need something. This is going to give us Snare, it's going to give AoE Major Breach, and it's going to proc Powerful Assault. Elemental Blockade is going to give us that easy procking of our back bar enchant. And then Restoring Focus is our major resolve skill, which also has some handy little extras attached to it. So it will provide us with stamina every 1 second. So 242 stamina every 1 second over the duration, which is really handy. It's a very cheap costing skill, 826 stamina to cast it. And then while the rune is active, you heal for 811 health every 1 second, scaling off your max health. Standing within the rune increases the healing done by 200%. So you don't need to stand inside this rune, you just cast it and it'll be on the ground. And then you don't have to be inside it. But if you do stand inside of it, 200% increased healing might be nice, especially during heavy damage phases. Then we have to use Silver Leash for a chain, just in case we have any adds or any stragglers that we didn't quite get in. And then we've got Aggressive Horn for that major force buff for the group. When we look at other passives and skills that you could use, Focus Charge is a kind of a gap closer. There's not really much use for that in PvE content, but it does provide major protection. And it will interrupt enemies. It's like an AoE interrupt depending on which morph you take. So you can go in there with that toppling charge, and it will stun enemies, it will set them off balance, it will all do all that kind of stuff. So depending on if you wanted something like that, I don't personally like it, but you could use it. Luminous Shards is another really good skill, especially in groups where you want to provide some additional resource benefits. So you can throw this onto the enemy, it does damage, but then your group can use the synergy, and that will restore Magicka and stamina, which is really, really strong, especially if you don't have a healer in your group. For the passives, you don't need Piercing Spear, although you can take it later on. Spear Wall, gain minor protection for 6 seconds, reducing damage taken by 5%. So when you activate your Radiant Ward, it will proc Spear Wall as well. Burning Light isn't something that you need to have once again. And then Balance Warrior will increase your resistances, so you must take that one. For Dawn's Wrath, you could take Backlash if you wanted to. You could use Purifying Light for an extra heal. Power of the Light if you wanted to. If you wanted to apply the Sundering effect, which is going to give you minor breach. Not something that you really need to have, especially not when you're using Live in Dark, but that is just something that's optional use. For the passives, Enduring Rays increases the duration of your Sunfire, Eclipse, Solar Flare and Nova abilities, so you're going to get increase on your Live in Dark there. Prism is going to give you 3 ultimate when you cast the Dawn's Wrath ability, so that's nice. Illuminate is your group buff. It's going to provide minor sorcery to you and your group for 20 seconds, increasing spell damage by 10%. So if that applies to your group, that could be a nice little buff. And then Restoring Spirit reduces the health, Magicka, stamina, and ultimate cost of your abilities by 5%. On the Restoring Light side of things, we've got one extra skill here, which is Extended Ritual. I really like this skill, but it's hard to try and fit this in on the bar. But you've got a heal for you and your group, but it will also purify and cleanse people, and it will give a Purify synergy. So it is really good, and it's good for proccing gear sets, it's good for proccing different things, it's good for proccing some passives as well. So this could be used as an optional skill. It's something that you definitely want to consider if you can fit it in, especially for boss fights. So on boss fights where you don't need to use Power Slam, get that Extended Ritual in there, and that's going to give you some extra things to benefit your group. With the passives here, you've got Mending, which these are all mainly like healing based passives, so you're restoring the healing effects from your Restoring Light abilities is up by 12%. Sacred Ground is going to give you minor mending if you stood inside your own effects, and increases the amount of damage you can block by 10%, so a really good passive for a tank. Light Weaver, when you heal an ally under 50%, you're going to give them 2 ultimate, so if you've just got Extended Ritual down on the ground, someone goes under 50%, this is automatically just going to proc. And then Master Ritualist, not something you should be doing, you shouldn't be resurrecting allies, but if you do, it's going to be faster and you're going to give them more resources back. And last but not least, we have the Warden tank. So for the Warden, we do have Pierce Armor for the Minor Breach, the Major Breach and the Taunt. We've then got Fetcher Infection. This is to proc a bunch of passives, but it's also going to be applied to the enemy. It's going to do damage, and then it's also going to apply minor vulnerability. We've then got Enchanted Growth. This is again to proc passives, and this is going to give your group minor intellect, minor endurance, increase the Magicka and Stamina Recovery. It's going to heal them, and it's going to heal you as well. Then got Polar Wind, which is a massive heal. It's really, really good. So you're going to heal yourself, and then it's going to heal one other ally, and then it's going to heal you every 2 seconds for 10 seconds, and it's going to scale off max health. So this is your main tank heal skill, which is really strong. Then we've got Power Slam, which will provide you with that proc for your Void Bash set to chain enemies in. Replenishing Barrier is going to give you that Magicka Recovery from your Magicka Aid passive. On the back bar, you've got Destructive Clench for that Frost Clench, Major Maim, Minor Maim, and it's a Taunt and a Minor Brittle proc as well. Razor Caltrops for the Major Breach AoE effect. It's also going to be your PA proc, and it's also going to be a snare for the enemies as well. Then you've got Elemental Blockade for your back bar enchant proc. You've got Expansive Frostcloak for your Major Resolve, but it's also going to buff up your group with Major Resolve, which makes this extra strong because it's going to improve the survivability of your group. And then you've got your kind of pull/chain skill with Frozen Device, although this can be quite slow. In a lot of situations, it might actually be better to just switch this out for Silver Leash. But if you can use this, then definitely do, because this is Magicka costing, much more sustainable, and especially if you know where enemies are going to be, you can kind of throw these ready for them to run onto them, and then they'll just get pulled straight to you. Finally, you've got Aggressive Horn for that group Major Force buff. When we look at other skills and passives, Deep Fissure is something is potentially used. I've seen it being used in some different situations. I've used it in trials, not so much in dungeon content, but it's a way to apply Major and Minor Breach to enemies without using Pierce Armor. So it's another alternative, but it won't taunt. You've got Bull Niche, which is a sustain tool, so if you're struggling for stamina, then get this slotted on your bar. Once every 5 seconds, it also removes a negative effect, so it's like a free purge. 4,992 stamina over 25 seconds, so it's like a slow ticking. So it can be a bit annoying. It's not quite a burst, but if you keep this active for an entire fight, it will be quite a lot over an entire fight. You're also going to get Major Brutality and Sorcery, which isn't massively useful, but it's an increase in damage. But it's definitely something that you can consider if you're struggling for sustain. What you can do as well is you can actually reactivate this, and because it's free, you can just spam cast it, and every time you cast it, it will give you the first tick of stamina. It will also cleanse a negative effect, so you don't have to just wait for this to cleanse negative effects. You don't have to wait for this to keep providing you stamina. If you cast it more frequently every second, then it's going to give you that first tick much faster. Then you've got Deceptive Predator. This is a speed boost skill that you might want to use sometimes, but by having it slotted, it also gives you minor evasion, which reduces your AoE damage that's incoming, and it gives you immunity to snares and immobilization. So it's a nice skill to use for ad pulls to get through them a lot faster if you need it. With your passives, Bond with Nature, anytime one of your animal companion skills ends, you heal. So you're going to obviously have Fetch Infection, you might have Bullnetch, and then that's going to give you the increased heal. Savage Beast, when you cast Animal Companion ability, while you're in combat you generate ultimate, so a nice bit of ultimate gain. Obviously with Bullnetch it's free, so you can definitely get that for a free cost if you are using that skill. Flourish, which increases your Magicka and Stamina Recovery by 12% if an Animal Companion ability is slotted. If you don't have one of these slotted, then make sure you use Feral Guardian as your front bar ultimate, because 12% increased recovery is something you can't afford to turn down. So if you don't have one of these skills, then definitely make sure you slot in that instead to get it. On Green Balance, the other skill we've got here is Corrupting Pollen. This is a possible useful skill because it's going to provide that big AoE heal. So if you're not hitting your group with Enchanted Growth, then you can use Corrupting Pollen instead to heal your group. And you're also going to apply Minor Cowardice to the enemy, which reduces their weapon and spell damage. So it's something that you can get from a Nightblade, but it's like another way to debuff enemies if they do a lot of damage, which can be really good. If you need a bit of extra self-healing and maybe some resources from your passives, using Living Trellis is an option. It's going to heal you every second, and when it expires it gives a burst heal. But you can sometimes apply this to somebody in your group, so if you are there without a healer, this could be useful. It's good to put it on yourself if you can as well, so that's just another optional skill. For the passives, they're all healing based, so when you heal yourself an ally under 40%, you get Major Mending. You've got increased... This is one of the strong passives, Nature's Gift. When you heal an ally with a Green Balance ability, you gain 250 Magicka or Stamina, whichever pool is lower. So that is why Corrupting Pollen, Enchanted Growth, maybe putting this on people, this is a good way to proc that to keep getting more stamina, especially. And it will be stamina most of the time because your stamina resource is usually the one which is going to be lower from blocking and dodging and breaking through and that kind of stuff. Emerald Moss increases your healing done, so that's nice as well. And then your main group buff here is Maturation, so when you activate a heal on yourself and ally, you grant minor toughness increase in max health. So that's why you need to slot something to proc that. Now, these are both really good skills, but using Energy Orbs is also another one. But yeah, Corrupting Pollen is really good if you're struggling with the group positioning. It's a much bigger area. Enchanted Growth, if your group are well positioned, you can just cast it at them. That one works the best one, but yeah, your Maturation passive is your main group buff. Winter's Embrace, we've already looked at most of these, but Gripping Shards is a really good skill, especially for ad pulls. So for ad pulls, you could take off Fetcher Infection and use that instead, because Gripping Shards is going to provide you with a immobilization. It's an AoE immobilization around your character as well. Unlike some classes that only do it in front of them or they're not very well positioned, this is a really good one that does put it in a similar way to Choking Talons, so it's a very strong one, and you should definitely use this if you want more control over the ads. It also does quite a bit of damage and will apply the chilled status effect as well, which can potentially proc Minor Brittle. And then the last skill we've got is Shimmering Shield. If you're in a situation with lots and lots of projectile damage, this is going to put a massive damage shield around your character. It's going to be able to absorb 3 projectiles, and then it's going to give you Major Heroism to increase your ultimate gain by 3 every 1.5 seconds for 6 seconds. So it's a really nice way to get some extra ultimate as well if you're in a situation where you're going to receive projectile damage. And then for the passives here, we've got Glacial Presence. Increases the chance to apply the chilled effect. That can be quite nice if you're struggling to do that. Frozen Armor, increasing your armor based on how many of these abilities you've got slotted. And then Icy Aura reduces the effectiveness of snares applied to you. I do feel like the Warden has some of the weakest passives, but there are some good ones in there that you can use. And then Piercing Cold is an optional one that you want to use if you've got the extra skill points. So that is everything for the skills for all of the classes. And the final thing we're going to look at is how do you play this build. We want to give a bit of a how to play in kind of ad pulls and bosses. So this is basically all the information you need to know about how to play in general for dungeon content. So generically for ad pulls, they are kind of straightforward. You can do them quite rotationally. You always want to try and stay ahead of your group, so if you do need to use one, use a speed boost such as Race Against Time to stay ahead of your group, ready for those ad pulls. Before you instigate combat, you want to make sure you're using any kind of pre-buff skills to buff up your armor, and then you want to instigate combat with a Frost Blockade. After that, you use a Razor Caltrops and you place that in front of the enemies for them to walk onto it, and this will snare them to slow them down, and it will also activate your Powerful Assault on the group that's just behind you. Once you've done that, you hit Power Slam when all enemies are within range to pull them into a stack with the Vatashran Void Bash set. You then follow that up with an Immobilized skill or some kind of crowd control skill that will keep everything on top of your Caltrops and on top of your blockade, and this is going to provide a lot of different debuffs. At this point, you want to taunt any enemies that are elite enemies because you do not want them to hit your group, or taunt anything that will heavy attack and kill your group with a one-shot. You want to bash while facing the whole stack of enemies to try and proc Turning Tide. Then you want to cast Pulsar to AoE debuff enemies. This will apply a lot of different effects, a lot of different debuffs that will allow your group to kill these enemies faster. You can cast this multiple times to make sure that they are all affected by the chilled effect from the Frost Staff. Chain in any enemies that you've missed with the Power Slam because sometimes there might be one ad at the back of a room that was a little bit out of range and didn't get pulled in. Shield and heal up as and when it's needed during these ad pulls, and then only block heavy attacks from enemies. You don't need to really block anything. You should be able to survive these encounters fairly easily and just block those heavy hits. Boss fights are not quite as rotational as ad pulls, with a big difference between the classes and the addition of various different mechanics. Generally speaking, we can consider a kind of guideline set things that you need to do during boss fights. So number one is pre-buff. Before you instigate combat, you need to activate any pre-fight skills. Things like Major and Minor Resolve are obviously the staple things that you would always cast before, but there may be other things as well that will proc different passives and benefits for your group. 2, we've got Initiate. So begin the fight once everybody is ready. Initiate combat with a Frost Clench range taunt to gain aggro and to debuff the boss. Then number 3, you want to position the boss. So there's always some kind of method to positioning a boss. In most cases, you just need to go to the boss and then turn it around so it's not facing the group. Sometimes, however, you may need to pull a boss into the middle of a room. Other times you might need to take it closer to the edge of a room. It really depends on what's going to be happening for mechanics in certain fights. In some situations you may need to walk around with a boss or take it to another location throughout the fight, usually if something spawns in a particular location. Number 4 is mechanics, and this is the part where it gets tricky. Each dungeon has its own unique mechanics, and you need to prepare yourself to block attacks, roll dodge attacks, look out for ads and taunt them and chain them in, move out of AoEs, self-heal, run around the room or away from different effects, and buff up and heal through heavy damage phases, and much more. Each dungeon has usually a specific couple of mechanics that you will need to follow. In Red Petal Bastion, for example, the boss will need interrupting. In Moongrave Fane, you will need to purge the dot that the boss puts on you, which then, if you tell your group to dodge roll, they can avoid getting it from you. In Depths of Malatar, you can take the boss to the edge of the room so you don't get the walls hitting you and you can just kind of stand still. So there's lots and lots of different things that you can focus on to stay alive and follow mechanics. 5, we've got rotation. So while you're in a settled state, it's essential to cast your skills. You can't just stand there holding block. You need to be maintaining some kind of activity. So especially focus on things like Pierce Armor, Frost Clench, Elemental Blockade, and then proccing your gear sets such as an Assault skill for Powerful Assault, Heavy Attacking to proc Archdruid, and blocking then bashing for Turning Tide, amongst other things that you may need to do to proc those gear sets. You'll then need to be active and cast any class buffs and debuffs that are specific for the class that you're playing. The main thing is to watch your ability timers and recast things when you have 1 second remaining on the timer. But things such as Frost Clench can be cast every 5 seconds to reactivate that Major Maim, and Minor Brittle to debuff the boss. So it's very important to keep up that rotation and just make sure you're giving your group various different benefits. If we've got Survival, this is something you can't really rotate, but you just need to be aware at all times. Make sure you're blocking heavy attacks and mechanics. Shield up before taking big hits or make sure you've got full health. Use healing over time skills to keep a constant tick of healing on yourself if you need it. And then use burst heals when you're below sort of 50 to 30% health to make sure you're recovering from any damage that you've taken. You've got to remember to break free from attacks that will root you in place. You need to interrupt bosses and different enemies at certain times when needed. in the majority of situations you can roll dodge to evade damage, which can be very, very helpful if you're close to dying. Just be aware that there are some dungeons where dodging will cause a boss to enrage or harm other members of your group. So the Coral Airy last boss, for example, if you roll dodge when the boss is heavy attacking, it will push your group into the water and they could die. And then number 7, we've got sustain. Always have your food buff active. Make sure you're utilising potions to buff up your recoveries and give you resources. You can either use potions on cooldown to give you a permanent buff of recoveries, or if you're not as confident, save them for emergency moments so you can just have a quick button to press to get a lot of resources back. Try not to block permanently. This is something you do not want to do. If you followed this build fully, then you should have no problem taking damage from light attacks without blocking, especially if you've got a healer or someone healing you, or any healing over time ticking on you. So you just don't need to permanently block. That is one of the main things that will cause sustain issues. Utilize skills and passives to gain resources. As a DK, for example, using your ultimate or using Igneous Shield will return stamina or all your resources. Heavy attacking is a vital part as well because it returns a lot of resources, and you need to time it. So make sure you're doing the heavy after a heavy theory, where when a boss has heavy attacked you, you follow it up with a heavy attack because that is the moment where the boss isn't really going to do anything else back to you. But the main two things that cause people problems with sustaining dungeon content is overblocking and overcasting skills. So just make sure that you're not overcasting. Look at those ability timers, castings on cooldown rather than halfway through its duration, and then make sure you're not permanently blocking. You do not need to block all the time. It is safe to drop block. If you're getting healing, you don't have to block much at all. If you're not getting healing, you can just intermittently block. So block a hit and then take 2 hits unblocked. Block a hit, take 2 hits unblocked. Just space that blocking out and make sure you're not doing it on a permanent basis. So thank you very much for watching this video. It's been a very long one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something today. If you need any more help or assistance, make sure you check out the website, thetankclub.com. We've got loads of builds and info over there. You can also join my Discord, the Tank Club Discord, where we'll be able to answer any questions or information that you might have to go into there. Please let me know in the comments below what your favourite class is for dungeons and what your favourite gear sets are, what you're going to be playing as we move into this year. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.